Good evening, buenas noches, bienvenidos. El siguiente mensaje será repetido en español enseguida. I would like to provide a brief overview of tonight's meeting. After a few procedural items, the board will dedicate 30 minutes to public comment. At the end of the meeting, there will be another and final opportunity for additional public comments. So if you do not get to speak during the first call, we encourage you to stay. To request to speak during public comment, please raise your hand now by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen and selecting the raise your hand button. And selecting the raise your hand. To comment by phone, please raise your hand by pressing *9. If you wait to raise your hand until public comment starts, you will not get to speak and you will have to wait until the second opportunity. When called upon, you will be promoted to a panelist, which means you will appear on screen. And so if you do not wish to appear on camera, please disable the camera on your end. The board president will usually call our students first. So if you are a student who wishes to speak tonight, please write student at the end of your name. Board president will also determine to set tonight's time at 1, 2, or 3 minutes per speaker, and on an individual basis also has the discretion to allow for additional time for those that need translation or have other needs. When your time has elapsed, you will see Vice President Brown hold up a sign letting you know you have 15 seconds left. If you are still speaking, please complete your sentence, but try not to speak beyond your time. Thank you. Quisiera proporcionarles un breve resumen detallando el orden de esta reunión. Después de unos procedimientos preliminares, un periodo de media hora será dedicado a comentarios del público. Al final de la junta habrá una segunda y última oportunidad para quienes no pudieron participar durante la primera llamada. Para participar en comentario público, por favor seleccione el botón levantar la mano o raise your hand abajo de su pantalla. Para participar por teléfono, por favor presione estrella 9. Al ser llamado, se le otorgarán 1, 2 o 3 minutos, dependiendo de la dirección del presidente. Si desea participar en comentario público, favor de levantar la mano ya que cuando el periodo comience, tendrá que esperarse hasta la segunda llamada, ya que será demasiado tarde. Usualmente el presidente llamará a los estudiantes primero, o si hay estudiantes que desean participar esta noche, favor de indicar que son estudiantes, escribiendo estudiante después de su nombre. Una vez más, el presidente otorgará 1, 2 o 3 minutos por orador y tiene la discreción de otorgar tiempo adicional a quienes requieren traducción o cualquier otra adaptación especial. Cuando haya transcurrido su tiempo, verá a la vicepresidenta Brown levantar un sign indicando que le faltan 15 segundos. Si todavía no ha terminado sus comentarios, por favor termine su oración, pero trate de no sobrepasarse de su tiempo. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chavez. I'm going to call the open session of this meeting to order at 7:05 p.m. Welcome everybody to the June 16th meeting of the Berkeley School Board. For the record, we began closed session tonight at 5:30 p.m. Ms. Chavez, can you please call the roll?
Director Ana Basudev.
Presente.
Director Laura Babbitt.
Here.
Director Julie Sinai.
Here.
Vice President Khadija Brown.
Present.
And President Ty Alpert.
Present. Thank you. And now we need to approve the special meeting agenda for tonight. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Motion by Vice President Brown. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Director Sinai. Ms. Chavez?
Director Basudev.
Yes.
Director Babbitt.
Yes.
Director Sinai.
Yes.
Vice President Brown.
Yes.
And President Alpert.
Yes. All right. Thank you. We have our agenda. Now I will turn it over to Vice President Brown to report out from our closed session.
Thank you, President Alpert. The report for closed session, all school board directors were present. For item 3.1.1, it was moved by President Alpert, seconded by myself, Vice President Brown, and the motion passed 5-0. For item 3.2, the board discussed. And for item 3.3.1, the board heard an update and provided direction. This ends the reading of the closed session notes.
And Vice President Brown, did you want to turn it over to
Oh,
Dr.
I am so sorry. Let me take a second. For item 3.2, for item 3.1.1, we have Superintendent Stevens, who will come and give the update.
Thanks very much, Vice President Brown. I'm really pleased to welcome to our BUSD family of administrators, Lisa Stupin. Lisa's just been appointed to be the incoming Director of State, Federal, and Special Projects. We will all miss the former director, Michelle Sinclair, who is also a principal here in Berkeley Unified, and we wish her very well as she moves to our neighboring city, Albany. And then welcome to you, Mrs. Stupin. We're really glad to have you coming on board. Mrs. Stupin is coming from Vallejo, not far away. She has held a very comparable position in her new role as Director of State, Federal, and Special Projects here in the district. She'll be responsible for a variety of programs, including early childhood education, coordinating our after-school program, working on the LCAP and LCAP updates. She is also responsible for maintaining the district's compliance with state and federal programs, and then also serves as a liaison between the district and important parent committees, such as the Parent Advisory Committee and the District English Learner Advisory Committee. So very pleased to be welcoming you aboard and looking forward to meeting you in person in July when you get started.
Anything else, Vice President Brown?
Nope, that is all from closed session. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stevens, and welcome Mrs. Stupin, who I don't think is with us tonight, as far as I can tell, but we all welcome her to the district. Now, as Ms. Chira said, now is the time to raise your hand if you would like to give public comment. If you don't raise your hand now, you can give public comment at the end of the meeting, or at one of the two public hearings that we have in the middle of our agenda tonight. It's a little bit unusual. But for this public comment period, now is the time to raise your hand. We have a small crowd of about 17 people here tonight, but it's a hearty group who is coming to our meetings even after school is out. Taliva Martin, I know your hand is raised, and I know you're here to give comment from the Parent Advisory Committee. I don't know if you're also here to give your own public comment as an individual, which you can just tell us when we get to you. But we should have time for each person to have 3 minutes tonight. Carrie Rubinski will be our last speaker. And so anybody who raises their hand after her will be able to speak later in the meeting. But our first speaker is Eliska Herrera de Salvatierra, followed by Paz Melendez Canales. And Vice President Brown will be doing the timer, and we'll give everybody 3 minutes. Go ahead, Eliska.
Well, thank you. My name is Eliska Herrera. I'm the parent of a future 4th grade student at Sylvia Mendez. And now I have the pleasure to be the DLAG rep of the school as well. I want to take this opportunity to greatly support the new student assignment policy for the 2WA program that includes heritage language speakers. This policy means a step forward to a more equitable, inclusive, accurate admission process that will respond to the cultural needs of the program and the Latinx community. I also want to advocate for a truly commitment to support our English learners. The district's data shows that the achievement gap of our students is huge in comparison to district overall, more than 60% of disadvantage at reading and math. So it's time to take the urgent actions to lift English learners, such as to fully fund at long term the 2WI program with reliable sources to commit with the success of the program, to guarantee full-time key positions of bilingual ELD and math intervention teachers, essential to support our students at Mendez and other schools with English learners. And finally, to create a robust parent engagement plan to accurately support parents at each site and give them the opportunity to be allies with the district and take part effectively in their children's education. I know the challenge to live for students is big, so the actions the district must take must be goal-oriented, thoughtful, and partner with the advisory committees to achieve the LCAP goals and change once and for all the future of our English learners and the Latinx community overall. thank you. Please support our students because they have the right and we owe that to them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Paz Melendez-Canales, followed by Jessica Lesperance. Paz, you're muted. There you go.
Good evening. My name is Paz Melendez-Canales. Good evening, Board Director, Superintendent, and Community. My name is Paz Melendez-Canales, and I have students at Longfellow and Berkeley High. I'm here as a representative of Latinos Unidos of Berkeley. I'm here in support of the office specialists who have been recognized for the very important work they have been doing with the most marginalized and hard-hit families during the pandemic. And as we discuss expanding the Office of Family Engagement and Equity, I'd like to remind you that 10 years ago, when the office was established, families asked for a full-time liaison per school site, and that promise has yet to be fulfilled. The office also needs to shift a service model to family engagement model, which is a proven equity strategy for addressing the opportunity gap and improving student outcomes, particularly for Black, Latinx, and multilingual learners in BUSD. The community deserves to know what the district vision is for family engagement and what the plan is to achieve that vision. A vision without a plan is just a dream. We recommend that some of the COVID fund be used to invest in contracting a facilitator to help the office staff develop a 5-year strategic plan for family engagement with specific measurable outcomes to demonstrate how their work impacts the closing of the achievement gap and establish a parent advisory committee for the Office of Family Engagement and Equity. I would also like to mention some of the budget items Latinos Unidos is recommending that you fund, and these include the PICE, CAVE, and the EL Master Plan Facilitator and Puente Project, which I believe you already are supporting, and we thank you for that. We're also in favor of an office specialist at every school site, as I mentioned before, ELD coaches and training for them for every site, the funding of an EL math intervention teacher at Sylvia Mendez, Longfellow, and Berkeley High to deal with the huge achievement gap that our English learners in math are experiencing right now. Dedicated Spanish bilingual staff that works at the district office to help with communications, parent engagement, and partnering with OFI to build the true partnerships our families need. 20% FTE for Longfellow TWI coordination, permanent bilingual substitute for Longfellow, and because when we are missing a TWI teacher at Longfellow, the students there are basically not doing the TWI program. It's like half of their education is lost in Spanish. So Spanish bilingual, also a Spanish bilingual assistance for Longfellow main office. We've been asking that for years. We have a huge number of Latino families there, so we need someone that they can communicate with at the office. One-on-one tutoring for Latinx and prioritized students district-wide, English and Spanish, and then community vision planning process for OFI and the Cesar Chavez Youth Leadership Conference in 2021-22. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Melendez-Canales. Jessica Lesperance, followed by Sarah Bowles.
Hello, I'm a parent of an incoming first grader and third grader at Malcolm X, and also I guess graduate product of the BUSD system as well. Hello. And I have company. I wanted to talk about two things tonight, and that's why I joined. One is I'm hoping that school buses can be available for young students to go to after-school locations, after-school care. I think that it's really useful for the community to be able to have multiple options, given that Learns and Bears is always so in demand that being able to take the bus to other locations has been really critical to us in order to kind of stay in Berkeley and work and continue to be here. And so I hope that that can continue to be something that remains in our community. And I also just wanted to give a big high five and shout out to you guys for rethinking the middle school selection policy again, I think it's long overdue, and I'm so happy that we are continuing to improve this and make middle school more equitable and integrated. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to see you. We
Nice to
grew up
see
in the Berkeley schools together. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for being here tonight. And thank you, kids, for being here too. Okay, Ms. Bowles, followed by Angela Gallegos Castillo.
Hey, so I wanted to follow up about the LCAP, obviously, because you're making some important funding decisions, and specifically about special education. So I read several versions of the LCAP, and with the exception of dyslexia, the LCAP doesn't name any specific disability. So I'm kind of perplexed about how we can develop a strategic plan that includes special education achievement goals when we can't even name the disabilities in the district. So I gave you some data last week about who's actually in special ed, but I think it's really important to kind of test some of the baseline cultural baggage we may have that informs misperceptions about who's in special education and what kids' needs are. So in 2015, California had a state task force on special education that suggested up to 90% of students receiving special education services possess the same range of intellectual ability as their peers, but obviously have speech, learning, hearing, mobility, or other disabilities. And then other data suggests that 9 out of 10 special education kids could be college or career ready, if they have the right support. So I think, like, in raw numbers, you've got to think about the nearly 1,200 kids in special education, that there are, clear, specific accommodation issues that we're not tackling for those kids. Like, we have the, individual support for, speech or OT, but like the actual curriculum implementation is an area that we need to focus on. And that needs to be driven by naming specific disabilities and having overall developmental and curriculum-based plans that are guided by those disabilities. So whether it's, dyslexia, which you do name, or autism, or, the other, like, just go down the list of disabilities, like, you need a specific targeted plan. Otherwise, we can't track these goals. Otherwise, we're just bumping up against proceduralism, where we're talking about minor shifts from 23, to 30% skill mastery, like in math or English. And it's just, it's 2021, and we're just getting to the point now where we're going to have, curriculum intervention for dyslexia. So you have to think, if we're just getting there now, shouldn't we take a holistic look at all of the categories of disability and reframe what our expectations are for kids? It's just like, we're not even seeing basic information, like how many kids are mild to moderate, how many kids are moderate to severe. Like, how can we as a community assess,
Thank you, Ms. Bowles.
programs? Like, it's just hard.
Thank you so much. Angela Gallegos Castillo, and then our final speaker will be Carrie Rubinsky.
Hi, good evening. This is Angela Gallegos Castillo. Good evening, Superintendent Brent and board members. I'm here on behalf of my children and my rising junior. I'm here representing Latinos Unidos of Berkeley, and coming to make public comment about the budget priorities. We sent out an email, and I'm not going to repeat all of the recommendations that my colleagues have already shared with you, Bas and Eliska. I did want to just share my thoughts about how the board members and the district can do a much better job of approaching the issues that we're facing in the district by taking a long-term view approach rather than making decisions on a short-term basis. I wanted to specifically talk about the district level parent engagement staff that we're advocating for. Latinos Unidos doesn't believe that a split position is a very good idea. One, because a parent liaison, a position that supports parents, has a full-time job at one school, let alone for a whole district. So I really urge you not to split the position that you would approve at the district level. I think there is enough work at the district level, developing the infrastructure to support parents in all different ways. The very simple example is the TWI program. If we're really to make that a stellar program, one for others to envy, we really need to take a structural approach where we look at the entire process for the student that goes from recruiting of parents and children into the program through elementary school, middle school, and high school. And I know that we have staff that are dedicated at each school to help bridge those and make those transition for students. But we really do need someone at the district level who's looking out for those kind of, that is overseeing those kind of conversations and to help build that infrastructure. Another example would be working with the communications team. We've been struggling for a very long time to get better and improved communication to Spanish speaking and other language families. So I urge you not to split that position. I want to just say thank you for working with us in terms of having conversations about our priorities. We want to continue being partners with you. And yeah, please, we have provided some very good recommendations for the school district to make decisions on, and we're here to support the community as well as you. So thank you so much, and happy end of the academic year.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our last speaker will be Carrie Rabinski.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Carrie Rabinski. I have a rising third grader and incoming kindergartner at Sylvia Mendez. And I was just, there's a couple things I wanted to comment. I think first was following up on another speaker, was our daughter currently attends, Berkeley after school and goes to many of the city programs. And there's been a lot of chatter around the community about bus service not being provided next year to after school from the school sites. I feel this is kind of a huge impact on families and really a crucial service that we all need, especially as we're coming out of a pandemic and parents and guardians are going back into more traditional office, meaning less flexibility to transport children around during the workday. So I wanted to just get further clarification on that, because I haven't been able to find any written communication about that from on the USD or on the transportation website. So, and everything I've heard is kind of secondhand. And I think the only other thing I wanted to just express support for the updated TWI enrollment policy and for having full-time OFI specialists at each school site. And so other than that, I just want to thank you all for your time and for your continued support for our community.
Thank you so much. On that particular issue about after-school transportation, the superintendent might be able to address it tonight. If not, I think you can expect district communication about it if it hasn't come out yet. But so we can provide some clarity around that, and hopefully some comfort too that things won't change. Okay, now we will hear from our district committees. I know we have a comment from the Parent Advisory Committee. Wait, no, unions first. Sorry about that. I don't see, are there any union? We don't have nobody has submitted a comment ahead of time through video, so not seeing anybody raising their hands. Now we will go to committee comments. So why don't we go to Parent Advisory Committee first? Taliva Martin and Sandra Loving. I think both. Ms. Chires, if you could promote them both. You might need to raise your hand, Ms. Martin. I don't know if you need to raise your hand or not, but Ms. Chires will promote you both. There you are. And go ahead. You have 5 minutes, and it's up to you how to use them.
Is Taliva here?
Yeah, she's here.
Okay, perfect. I'd like to begin by thanking my fellow PAC members who, despite the many constraints the PAC experienced this year, rallied over the past 6 weeks to fulfill our unique stakeholder role in BUSD. I urge the school board and the superintendent to read the full June 16th PAC comments submitted earlier today. Accountability is core to what the state intends LCAP plans to achieve, but accountability is what our new 3-year draft LCAP plan lacks. It may satisfy the state reporting requirements, but it does little to assess what is or isn't working. And without these assessments, there's no clear path forward. Across the board, the absence of accountability is what prevents Berkeley from making notable improvements in its prioritized students' proficiencies, let alone continuous ones. I'm going to share with you a few PAC recommendations to address the accountability omissions in our current LCAP plan and budget. What's been included to address math adds only patches to a patchwork approach that is not getting results. The PAC recommends that BUSD develop a math master plan to assess, integrate, and enhance TK through 12 Tier 1 math instruction. One math coach for 11 elementary schools has never made sense. If we're going to continue the math coach model, we need to staff it adequately and strategically. The PAC recommends having a district-wide math coach for each elementary school grade. We're all for more teacher collaboration, especially around math. Every school district is facing an emotional health crisis. As it stands, BUSD is going to spend our COVID relief funding without any commitments or accountability measures in place. There needs to be a line item in the budget for an amount to be spent, as well as an action in the LCAP plan. Up until now, they've been there, and it's imperative that we have a counselor at every school. So the question becomes how to fund the appropriate planning and staffing that PAC recommends, especially since our precious LCAP funds are dwindling. The answer is to spend our LCAP funds in the spirit of the law, which we're not doing. 60% of the actions in the draft LCAP plan are for universal programs, which is to say the services provided fall under the categories of core or mandated services that every district is required to offer. Our LCAP funds are not going to programs to go above and beyond for our prioritized students. Ultimately, if we spend our LCAP funds the way they are intended to be spent, if we drive accountability throughout all of our funding systems, we can better serve our prioritized students and better serve all our students.
Dear BUSD community, my name is Taliva Martin. I'm a parent of a rising 3rd and 5th grader at Thousand Oaks Elementary School. And tonight I'm representing the Parent Advisory Committee, which is charged with ensuring that the interests of the prioritized students at BUSD are reflected in the LCAP budget. These students include our African American and Latinx students, those eligible for free and reduced lunch, English language learners, homeless youth, and those in foster care. Tonight, the PAC shares a summary of its final comments in response to the draft LCAP plan for 2021 to 24, and our full comments will be emailed to each of you later this evening. We would like to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work in creation of the plan. It documents and details ongoing themes, categorizes and displays stakeholder interest, and generally checks the boxes needed for submission. What we ask the superintendent and the board to do now is to take the next step and actually commit to change. Commit and fully fund the programs that have been shown to work not just at BUSD, but are research proven strategies to improve outcomes specifically for prioritized students. Commit boldly and with conviction. Don't give our most struggling students a half-built engine and then tell them to go win the race. It isn't possible, and the stagnant outcomes in most areas have proven this. Commit fully, and when you have committed fully, support these programs while at the same time holding their implementers and leadership accountable. Develop expectations, metrics, and strategy that are reviewed periodically throughout the year and adjusted based on data, numeric, and narrative. OFI and Bridge are two programs who specifically and unequivocally have made a difference in addressing the needs of our prioritized students. And the benefit of these programs has been acknowledged by the board and reflected in the LCAP draft, but the partial support is not enough. The gnawing feeling of discomfort that you may have with the budget that we have with this plan is not that there are just not enough funds to satisfy all needs. It is because the plan lacks a clear commitment to fully invest in the programs that we know matter. It continues a status quo of scattering the funds so widely and randomly that we can't actualize success in the areas that need it most. BUSD leadership, we ask that you reconsider your decision to partially fund the needs of OFI and Bridge, give them what they need to succeed to their fullest potential, and give our prioritized students a real chance to finally move ahead. Let this plan reflect the values of the stakeholders in our district.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Martin and Ms. Loving. Really appreciate your comments and the full comments that you emailed to us earlier today. Thank you very much. I don't see any other committee members, so that means it's board comment and superintendent comment time. Is there someone who'd like to start us off?
Sure, I'll start us off.
Thank you, Director Babbitt.
Thank everyone for all of their hard work thus far this year. And thank those who are still coming to the board meetings to help us get through this final budgeting season. Definitely want to appreciate the Parent Advisory Committee for all of your hard work and dedication through many hurdles with this year and challenges that we've overcome. We will be reading your full comments and trying to address them, and hoping that you will hear from our hearts that while this PAC plan, this LCAP plan is what we may be approving, it is not the end all be all. And we will be revisiting this to make sure that we can include those accountability measures that you all feel are important, that we also so urgently feel are important. Thanks again to the BSEP P&O committee for your oversight work. I have been the board liaison to both of those committees, the construction bond oversight committee, the audit committee. Everyone worked so hard and is so passionate about making sure that BUSD can be the best that it can be. And so I just wanted to thank all of you for all of your work this year, and know that we hear you and that we are going to be responding. Thanks.
Thanks, Director Babbitt. Who's next?
Okay. I too want to thank everybody for coming out, and I really want to echo Director Babbitt's applause for both the Parent Advisory Committee and all of our parent committees that have worked so hard under very unusual circumstances. It's a valiant effort in a normal school year, but in this particular school year where there's been the balancing literally at the moments of work, family, students, that it's been an amazing contribution, an extremely valuable contribution of all the family members that have been involved in the processes for the school district. So I really appreciate that. I would also, I have a couple of requests or referrals, and maybe one is being talked about tonight, but Superintendent, I would like to have you look into, if you don't fully report on it tonight, in your comments about what's going on with the after-school bus. That was new information I saw in the email, and so I'm hoping it can be clarified and that parents can head into the summer with clarity on what they can expect in the coming school year, especially since the school year does start earlier than previous school years. People need to be ready. I also would like to refer Ms. Bowles' comments from the last two meetings around looking at our special ed populations, not just within the LCAP, but we did a very comprehensive audit of our special ed and programs 4 years ago, I think. And I'd really like to see, what your vision and Director Messenger's vision is on how we're going to kind of dust that audit off and look at the recommendations that existed during that time, and think about some of the recommendations that Ms. Bowles has brought up around targeted strategies toward specific populations, because I think part of it is a question of how it's reflected in the LCAP, but it's also how is it reflected in our vision and our planning for our special ed program, and how that intersects with our general education program. So I appreciate her comments, and I'm interested in learning more about the approach that we're looking at taking. And then I just think the last thing is you know, there's so much work that's gone on in the last year. We appreciate our teachers. We appreciate all of our classified staff. And I want to give a shout out to our central administration and for staffing all of the committees, for staffing our negotiation tables, for staffing all the work that's been happening throughout this school year while the heavy load of managing all the work on top of COVID has been serious. So, you know, Dr. Stevens, please pass on our my appreciation, and you know, I look forward to the next school year being a little bit, you know, back to normal, but still fully engaged as we really move that forward.
Thank you, Dr. Sinai. Director Vasudev.
Thank you, President Alpert. I also just wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know these are the last, board meetings. So I really appreciate all the dedicated parents and members of the public that are here with us tonight. I want to echo my colleagues' gratitude for all our different committee members. I really appreciate just hearing the PAC and hearing representatives from DLAC and from our various committees come meeting after meeting and really be part of this process, right, of helping us make the best budget decisions that we can make. You're investing so much time as parent leaders, and I really value your input. Ms. Martin, I was really impressed by your comments tonight, especially, just the PAC in general, your comments calling for accountability and better support for OFI, for mathematics, just for accountability in our work and for the Bridge program. I really value hearing all of your feedback, and I know that you keep pushing us to do more, and we always want to do more, right? I think that's what makes the budget process so hard, is that especially on the equity front, we can always do more. So I really value all the feedback that you've come and given us tonight. También para los miembros de Latinos Unidos que nos acompañaron hoy, les quiero agradecer todos sus comentarios públicos, particularmente los comentarios con respecto a cómo nosotros apoyamos a las familias de nuestros aprendices de inglés. Yo creo que el plan maestro que se va a llevar a cabo el próximo año va a ser un paso importante para mejorar nuestra relación con los padres de nuestros estudiantes aprendices de inglés, y les agradezco mucho por acompañarnos hoy. I think, I also want to thank the Latinos Unidos members that came out and that keep pushing us to do better, especially with regards to how we serve our English language learners and how we do parent engagement. I think, again, it's one of these things like with OFI where we can always do more, but I do think that our superintendent and staff are working really hard to make sure that we have a robust English language learner master plan. And next year, I think you'll see some big positive changes, right? That will get us closer to that vision that you've been articulating in your public comments. I also want to say a big welcome to our students this week who are joining us for summer sessions. The summer has started and it's week 1 for all of our families in summer school. So I want to say welcome. I hope summer sessions are going well. Continue to reach out to us if you have any feedback on summer sessions, but I know that the staff worked really hard in putting a more robust summer program together for this year. And I agree with Director Sinai's comments on the need for more information about transportation. It sounds like something will be forthcoming from the central office soon about that, but I agree that it's really important. Parents are making decisions now for their after school programs. I know that I had to make decisions earlier on as a parent. I'm sure a lot of parents in our district are in that position. And so being able to communicate clearly about after school transportation for next year is incredibly important. So I will thank our superintendent for making sure that that information is out there to everyone. And thanks again for being with us in these last couple meetings.
Thank you, Director Vasudev. Vice President Brown.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out. I feel like I always say this because there are a lot of things to echo from my colleagues' sentiments, but I want to echo my board members' sentiments and what they said, and their thanks to the committees who gave public comment this evening and who really pulled on us to be more intentional about our allocations and be more intentional about who they are serving and how and why they are serving, along with metrics that should be associated with those. So thank you for those clear comments, and also for providing those comments as written information to us as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our newest employee, Lisa Mendoza, who the superintendent recognized tonight as someone who will serve as the Director of State, Federal, and Special Projects. So welcome to the district. And in the same breath, I want to take the opportunity to thank Michelle Sinclair for helping us through this incredibly dynamic and incredibly challenging year, and also helping us up to the very last minute with this LCAP and going back and making sure that this LCAP was one that was presentable, digestible, and also ensure that we covered every single aspect that we needed to cover. So thank you, Michelle, and you will definitely be missed. And finally, I am so excited about our discussion conversation this evening in regards to the African American Success Framework. About a year ago, the board passed the Black Lives Matter resolution. And so this work that we're seeing tonight, or this presentation that we will see tonight, is a direct response to that resolution. And so there have been so many people who have been working on this behind the scenes, in addition to our consultant, R.T. Fisher, as well as our superintendent. I know there's been support on this from a couple of different people in the persons of Anne Caligari, Bajay, and also Kamar, who's worked closely with this. So I'm excited to see this presentation to our entire board this evening, and look forward to the discussion part of it after the presentation is finished. So, and thank you all so much for those of you who are here this evening, who continue to come out. Even in June, after your children have graduated or been promoted, you still are coming to the meetings to offer very meaningful comments. And so we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Brown. And thank you to everyone for being here tonight. I'll turn it over to you now, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you very much, President Alper. I have just a few updates for the community this evening. I hope in just a moment of spare time that everybody will make their way over to our website and check out our recently published community report. Each year we put out a report about the good work happening in Berkeley Unified School District. This has just been completed. This year we're doing an electronic copy of that report, but mailing postcards to all 56,000 of our individual residences here in Berkeley, so that folks can check out the report. It is a testament to the volunteerism, to the heroism, to the sort of tenacity of the community to come together and serve our students over the course of this long pandemic year. So please do be aware of that report. And then a special thanks to two people behind the scenes who put that together. That's Audrey Lee and Trish McDermott. Thank you so much to both of you. For members of the public who are interested in tonight's conversation about the LCAP, please know that the full draft LCAP is available on our website, as well as an electronic feedback form that is still open that we continue to check. So if anything in our conversations tonight pique your interest, please make your way over to that plan and you'll find the full plan there. I also want to make members of the community aware that we are launching a process of community engagement with respect to our middle school student assignment policy. Last week, we sent out a survey. We're very happy with the responses back so far. Well over 1,000 families have responded. And we encourage members of the community who would like to learn more about our current policy and potential changes to that policy to attend one of two meetings, either on June 29th in English or June 30th in Spanish. That'll be an hour-long informational meeting where we'll share information about current policy and potential changes. So please do join us. Another word of thanks, I just want to acknowledge Rob Collier, who has served as PTA Council President for the last 2 years. He's cycling out of his term, and thanks, Mr. Collier, for your leadership and for being a good, strong partner to the district as we've navigated these difficult waters over the last year, particularly. For families who are interested still in accessing resources through our Ed Hub, please know that that collaborative partnership with the Schools Fund continues on through the summer. The Ed Hub is open at the Berkeley Adult School on San Pablo Avenue on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 5 o'clock. That's an excellent place to go for a whole variety of resources. It's also the case that vaccinations are available at Berkeley Adult School as well as COVID testing. So it is one-stop shopping for our families. A few people that I'd love to acknowledge had a key role in opening our summer programs this week. And thank you, Director Vasudev, for your acknowledgement that those programs started up. Within only 5 days of finishing our school year, we've launched yet another series of programs. So very special thanks to Erin Jorgensen, Brazil McIntyre, Angie Wan, who is on loan to us from the school's fund. Thank you for your work. Wynn Skeels has also been instrumental in all of this. And then representing Special Education Department, Florian Palma. Thank you. You all have been sort of pulling double duty now for a couple of months to launch these programs. And please know that we see you and recognize your hard work. And then finally, please know that we're in this moment of sort of transitioning protocols with respect to COVID safety. We did just recently send out a letter to all of our summer school families that we will maintain mask wearing in all of our summer program until June 30th at least. We are awaiting CDC guidance that we imagine then that the California Department of Public Health will pick up. And so just know that there are transitions taking place. Please also know that we're planning to discontinue surveillance testing for both students and staff on June 30th. That's in keeping with updated guidelines and reflective of the positive trend in COVID transmission in our community. And then finally, with respect to buses, I know that it was raised a little bit earlier. Just like we're planning on a full return to 5-day, full day school, we're also planning on returning to full capacity bus runs. We don't anticipate that there's going to be anything in the health guidelines that would prohibit us from using all of our fleet to serve all of the students in the same way we did pre-pandemic. So we'll commit to getting additional information out to families who may be using buses pre-pandemic, but please know that that is our core assumption here is that we will be back to normal with buses, and that's both morning and afternoon runs. So with that, President Alper, I'm going to turn it right back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. Okay, now we're going to move to our consent calendar. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar? Oh, Director Babbitt. Okay, is there a second?
A second.
Second by Director Vasudev. Ms. Chiras?
Director Vasudev?
Yes.
Director Babbitt?
Yes.
Director Sinai?
Yes.
Vice President Brown?
Yes.
President Alper?
Yes. All right. Thank you. And now we'll move right to item 12.1, which is a discussion item on our African American Success Framework update. Oops.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just queue up a presentation and then would like to welcome a very special guest this evening. So joining me as co-presenter is Robin Fisher. I'll ask Robin to do a little bit more of an introduction about the work that she does, but very happy to have her on board with the district and to lean on her expertise as we have over the last semester of closing out distance learning, but over the last semester worked internally to begin to lay out the elements of an African American success framework. So in this presentation, I hope to update the board and members of the community about the progress that has been made towards the completion of that framework. It's still in draft form. Talk a little bit about sort of where we've been as a community and discussions about serving African American students and families. Why the development of an African American success framework is particularly important to me as the superintendent of the district, how it is that we reached out to Robin Fisher and her organization for expertise, and then what we imagine to be the next steps. Ms. Fisher is going to describe some of the analysis that she's jumped into, documents she's reviewed, and really sort of lend her insight into both the strengths of the work that we've attempted in the past and then missing elements of the work as well. We do know that we plan to come back to the board very, very early. In fact, our first board meeting back in the summer, we proposed to come back to the board and provide further updates on work that we've been able to accomplish from one point in the summer, the beginning to the end of the summer. And Robin, are you there? Let me just confirm that you, I don't see you in my screen, but just want to make sure you're there.
She's here.
Great.
I'm here.
There you are. Welcome to you. We're glad to have you here. So for folks who have been following the history of Berkeley Unified, you will know that there have been many, many efforts now over decades to support African American students and their families. This list is by far, it's far from complete. but I've tried to represent some major milestones dating all the way back to 1968 in the formation of the Black Studies Department at Berkeley High School. Now still, and I think really sadly, continues to be the only Black Studies department in a public high school in this country. It is both a mark of distinction, but one that sort of is an ongoing signal about the path we have to travel together as a country. Jumping forward in time, many folks will be aware of an effort in partnership with the city of Berkeley to build the Vision 2020 plan, which attempted to create a set of milestones and metrics, as well as partnership framework between the city and the district. In 2014, a group of parent advocates, including our own board director, Laura Babbitt, were successful in advocating that an equity matrix be included in that year's LCAP. That was the first district LCAP. And that document, which is called Equity in Our Schools, a School Self-Assessment and District Audit Tool, is well worth looking at. And in fact, we've been returning to look at that tool, and I encourage folks to look it up. It's available on our website. It's a very thoughtful approach to encouraging ongoing equity-oriented assessments in our school sites. In 2018, the school board allocated funding to begin an African American Success Manager, sort of African American Success Project with a manager in that position. That position has focused heavily on the creation of the Umoja elective, currently at Longfellow, and I've listed that there as having just recently launched in the year of 2020. Last summer, you heard Vice President Brown mention the board's passage of Black Lives Matter resolution, which is a broad-ranging, very comprehensive and important resolution calling for a range of actions here in the district. And then in 2021, only several months ago, we passed the Coordinated Early Intervention Plan, or CSACE, which is a plan designed to interrupt a pattern of disproportionate sort of assignment to special education of African American youth. So I say all of these things rather just to say that there is a long sort of storied discussion here in Berkeley, and based on the data, we still have a path to travel. And so let's talk about that for just one moment. Why is it now, with all of these past efforts, that it feels important to pull together, to engage in deliberate reflection, to seek the expertise of an outside partner, to develop an African American success framework? It continues to be the case, and in ways that are alarming, that African American students are disproportionately likely to be suspended or expelled. Continues to be the case that they are disproportionately likely to be identified as having a disability and referred to special education services. That hence the CSACE plan that I just talked about. With respect to academic outcomes, these results are really problematic for Berkeley, and folks have been talking about this for a long time. They include disproportionality in outcomes for reading, and gifted and talented like programs, in getting mid-level math skills and accessing upper-level math courses, in grades related to math, completing a full sequence of college preparatory courses and being eligible to matriculate to both the University of California and the California State University, and then as well placement in AP classes. In every one of these measures and many others, we find disparities that are cause for alarm, and that really force us to continue this sort of process of introspection and force us to look more deeply at what we did accomplish and what we missed. So with that, we set out to find an expert partner, and we were very fortunate to not need to look far. We were very happy that RT Fisher Associates has agreed to work with us. A number of educators in our district, myself included, have been beneficiaries of programming that she's offered, professional development conferences, and have been watching intervention programming offered by this organization for a number of years. As we were working with Ms. Fisher to bring her on, we asked her to look uncompromisingly at our data, to look at past documents, to help us understand what other districts were doing right now that was leading either to success or that appeared potentially as promising. And then looking forward to the fall, we asked for her help to meaningfully engage stakeholders here in the community, and particularly educators and families of color and African American educators and families, and then help us answer this question that we just must really be unflinching about, and that is, what did we get right and what are we missing right now? Where do we go next? So the goal of developing this framework is really to have a multi-year comprehensive vision for ongoing investment, ongoing support, and accountability so that we can achieve greater levels of success for African American students and our families. This is a sort of project of deep personal investment for me. It's one I know I share with our staff. And so I'm very glad to hand it now over to Robin Fisher, who's going to describe work that she's been doing internally through these difficult conditions, to analyze past efforts, to understand where we are as a district, and then to help us point out where we need to go together. So with that, Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, welcome. We're really glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, Superintendent Stevens. I'm glad to be here again. My name is Dr. Robin Fisher, and I am pleased to be able to give you all an update as to what we have collectively been doing, thinking about very specifically, very strategically about the needs of African American children in Berkeley Unified School District. So when we think about the African American Success Framework, it's important to see that it's, again, you saw from 1968 to today, we've been thinking about how best to support Black children. Well, this specifically is a 3-year strategic plan that has recommendations, action steps, and an implementation timeline that's informed by, and again, Superintendent Stevens already began to talk a little bit about that. It's asset mapping of previous and current district initiatives. We took a very deep dive into every single data source that we absolutely could find as related to Berkeley as a whole, specifically to Black children and their academic outcomes. We did that by looking at your LCAP goals, your LCP learning loss strategies from last year's response to the crisis that we all have experienced, as well as your CSA's measurable outcomes. We wanted to make sure that there was some intersectionality between those particular documents and that we weren't creating more on top of what you already are accountable for. We also met very regularly with your principals, vetting these ideas, making sure that they were part of the process. We were part of the facilitation team, along with Ann Caligari of OFI and Nina Goldman from Vision 2020, to host principal and family learning circles. We read through transcripts of town hall meetings. We read through transcripts of stakeholder focus groups and review sessions, as well as wanted to make sure that at the center of everything that we were thinking about, that we honored the board's resolution as related to Black Lives Mattering in this district. As I mentioned briefly, we really wanted to make sure that the success framework wasn't something on top of what you all were already accountable for. So we wanted to make sure that whatever it is that we were going to propose or recommend, it was in context with what the federal government, what the state of California was already asking the district to do and be responsible for. And since Black children, as we just heard the data, are disproportionately the highest group achieving the fewest outcomes with respect to academic outcomes, we wanted to make sure that we saw what else was happening in the district that was addressing the needs of Black children. So that's your LCAP, your CSAs, and your LCP. And you'll notice when we look at the recommendations that they are center of these 3 reports specifically, with the context again of your Black Lives Matter resolution that you all approved, as well as the superintendent's high priority budget items. So we wanted to make sure that, again, we were in alignment with what the district was already responsible for. So what this is here is a very aggressive timeline. We started this conversation about 1.5 years ago with Superintendent Stevens, with Ann Caligari and Kamaro Gwynn, thinking about what we would need to do to put this plan in place. And because of what happened in the world, we had to postpone some of what it is we were planning and put together a very aggressive timeline since January. So what you see here are all of the activities that we have completed successfully since January to date. And as you can see, there are multiple dates and workshops and work groups and focus groups and meetings with principals and with staff members to ensure that we, in the time period that we had available to us, were able to present this update to you this evening. And I think this is really important, this particular slide, because it does speak to what Superintendent Stevens mentioned about comparative analysis. I do have had the pleasure and am currently working with about 14 school districts across the state right now. And we wanted to make sure that the work that you all were beginning to do very seriously with respect to Black African American students, that we saw what else was happening in the state, in Alameda County, around other states as well as what folks were doing with respect to Black children, to give us an idea of where is we want to make sure that this particular framework, if there were any gaps, that we close them. And so what you see here is that we did an analysis of those school districts that were most similar to Berkeley Unified as relates to the size of their district, the number of Black children that attended there or were enrolled in their district, as well as the kinds of elements of African American initiatives that existed. And what you'll see here is Berkeley's there, the second line. We took a look at your 2014-17 LCAP review, specifically the equity matrix that Superintendent Stevens mentioned, and noticed that there were some elements that were not mentioned explicitly in those particular documents as related to parent-family engagement or equity, radical equity, and what that looked like and meant, of being very thoughtful about what authentic learning and engagement looked like, and speaking specifically to community engagement. So when we saw that, we wanted to make sure that this iteration of the framework absolutely spoke to those particular areas. And so you'll notice in the recommendations that we were very conscientious about making sure that those areas that are currently blank are filled in. This, to me as one of the facilitators of this process, and to the group of administrators, the Ed Services team that was really responsible for meeting with me on a very regular basis, our overarching goal was to make sure that this framework served, and we found a way to serve every single Black African American child in the district. And one of the ways that we thought we could do that is to really see who is in the district per grade level. So we broke it down by grade level. How many Black children are there in each grade level, so that we could begin to think systemically about how do we provide services. And when you see it broken down in bite-sized chunks, then it makes it a bit more manageable. And that's what, as working in a working group, we wanted to make sure that whatever it is that we created, that we made sure that we were addressing the needs of every student and what that looked like and meant. So this slide gives you an example of when you take a look at per grade level, that this is a very manageable initiative as far as making sure that we address the needs of students who need it the most. So an example of a systemic implementation approach, when we say we wanted to serve all students, approximately 1,300 students, about, again, on any given day, 13 to 14% of the student population. We wanted to figure out a way that this work would last beyond, it's a 3-year strategic plan, but beyond the efforts that have happened in the past. And the way to do that is to make sure that it's integrated, it's systemic. One of the areas that we work in is making sure that it's not just a one and done. This kind of work doesn't work that way if we want to see the kinds of changes that have to happen for Black children. The ways that we see that happening is that there's 3 major levels or layers to our work. First, there is a macro level. What are those district-wide initiatives that will serve every single family? And we wanted to make sure that the framework did identify what could those initiatives be that served every family, African-American family in the district. What would that look like? What would that mean? Then we said, because there is a pre-TK 8 and then your high school level, what are those meso level initiatives that are division-based that we could be thoughtful about? It goes one step further into being much more systematic about how to serve students in those 2 specific divisions. And then lastly, what could be those micro or site-based initiatives that we really could dive even deeper? We could actually impose some interventions that we could use as pilots or models for either the meso or the macro levels or initiatives. And we wanted to make sure that this particular framework had all three of these levels so that we can really see which of our imposed interventions work the best for whom and under what circumstances and conditions. And that's, I think, a difference from what we have attempted in the past from 1968 to today, is being very thoughtful about a systemic approach to identifying not only needs, but also interventions to address those needs. Now we're going to get a little academic here because it's important for us to see that in addition to the systemic framework, we also wanted to move beyond just academic achievement outcomes. We usually think of, when we think about the data that is expressed about how students are performing or not performing, it's based on a standardized set of data that we have very little control over, actually. So we wanted to go a little bit deeper, significantly more deeper. So we are looking at the strategic plan is organized into two major categories: academic achievement and culture and climate. Now, under each of these larger categories, you have subcategories. For academic achievement, we wanted to really understand, and I'll show you in just a moment, we want to look at access and inclusion, opportunities to learn, and achievement in outcomes, and what that looks like as far as developing metrics to determine whether or not Black children are meeting thresholds that we set for them outside of just standardized tests and what those scores look like and mean. We also wanted to look at culture and climate because we know that these two things go hand in hand. We want to look at school climate, we want to look at disciplinary policies and practices, and we must look at community engagement. What is the culture and climate of the ways in which our school sites, our district engages with the community in which it resides? And so the framework takes a look at these two categories and their subcategories when we think about the recommendations. So let me just go a little bit deeper. I'm going to get a little bit closer here because what this actual matrix shows you here is those two larger categories: academic achievement and culture and climate, as well as the three subcategories under each. And it aligns it to the district's LCAP goals. There's 4 of them, as you all know. I know that you've been doing a lot of work with LCAPs. And your CSACE measurable outcomes. And we use the CSACE because it is a plan, because since 2011, Black children and Latinx children have been disproportionately referred for special education. And that's why we have the CSACE. But it's been since 2011, and we wanted to really wrap our arms around it and understand what those measurable outcomes are and how we can align with them. So if you take a look at academic achievement, you'll see when we talk about access and inclusion, we're actually saying that we expect, the district expects that African-American students have access to and are included in rigorous and relevant courses, extracurricular activities, and college and career preparation. Now, this is very important because I know that you all know this data point. Our students, our Black students are absolutely, and we should applaud that they are graduating at higher rates from Berkeley High School, but they are not prepared, and we should be concerned about college preparation. 56% of our students graduating are eligible to walk in the doors of our CSU and UCs as far as college eligibility, in comparison to 80+% for their white and Asian peers. And so we want to be thoughtful about what that means as relates to access to and inclusion in honors, AP, and IB classes, where we know that it's less than 40% of Black children that are enrolled in those classes that would impact access and inclusion. We also are looking at opportunity to learn. Schools provide multiple opportunities and strategies for African-American students to achieve academic success. What does it look like for interventions? What does intervention look like specifically for Black children? Can we disaggregate that from all of the other intervention that's taking place? This particular subcategory asks that question. Where are those opportunities to learn? And then lastly, achievement and outcomes. African-American students are expected and prepared to perform at high levels. Disparities in achievement and outcomes among student groups and disproportionality in placement in educational programs are eliminated. That's the goal. And so we're always looking for in this framework, where are there opportunities that already exist that we can leverage where that particular goal can be measured against. You'll see the same for culture and climate, where we're looking at school climate and disciplinary policies and practices and how they align with your LCAP goals, especially with your goal 3, safe, welcoming, inclusive schools, and in your increasing parent engagement and building MTS framework for your CSACE. So we wanted to kind of show you that every recommendation is in alignment with, or we wanted to show where there was alignment with existing goals and outcomes. Now we're at the, I would say, very close to a draft, a good draft of the framework where we can now present it to you all for an update. And it's important for you all to really know that we've been very thoughtful about vetting these recommendations, especially with the professionals in the district who are responsible for implementation of these recommendations. Your Ed Services team has been amazing. Your principals have been amazing with respect to being thoughtful about how to vet these recommendations. And so with the recommendations, we vetted on a scale of 1 to 10, whether or not the folks that were reviewing it thought that it would directly impact classroom instruction or teacher practice and academic achievement. We looked at fiscal implications of the recommendations. We looked at how they were aligned to academy division initiatives or practices. We wanted to make sure that these were evidence or research-based recommendations and really thoughtful about whether or not they would have an impact on outcomes for students based on the metrics that were chosen, as well as we wanted them to ask any additional questions that we might need to be aware of, that we might be blindsided by, haven't thought of. And so we wanted to make sure that folks really had an opportunity to vet these recommendations, as well as be thoughtful about who the stakeholders and decision makers were for each of these recommendations. And that's important for me to note that your current African-American Success Manager had a proposal around this idea of acting now and having a process by which to vet all recommendations. That was Kamaro Gwynn's initiative for Act Now. We built upon that, as well as used your Ed Services team, really looking at Ms. Debbie Dean. She was instrumental in this work that we're doing as well, again, and Caligari for being my direct liaison, as well as your associate superintendent at the time, Ajay Thier. After that initial vetting process, because there's more vetting to do, and you'll see when we talk about next steps, we have more vetting to do, but there are 4 major recommendations. After all that's said and done, we narrowed it down to 4 major recommendations that the framework is going to propose that the district addresses and considers for implementation. 4 major recommendations with sub-recommendations and then corresponding action items. And I just want to reiterate, it was crosswalked with your LCAP goals, your LCP strategies, your Black Lives Matter resolution, high priority budget items, as well as a phased implementation timeline. We know that we can't do all of this in an academic year, again, which is why we've chosen a 3-year implementation plan. The 4 recommendations, as you see here, I won't read them to you, but these are the 4 recommendations that the working group and the Ed Services team that was assigned to this project vetted, and they have a series, again, of sub-actions underneath them. Now, in addition to these 4, what the working group wanted us to really focus on was what were those high priority recommendations, and that would be recommendation number 1 and recommendation number 4. Recommendation number 1 is utilizing approved, what we call clear, culturally and linguistically responsive and relevant social, emotional, academic development interventions to address the academic performance of African American students. First things first, we need and must improve the data points that we heard earlier. So that's the #1 priority of the recommendations. And the next, for this next academic year that we are proposing, is promoting parent and community partnerships and alliances with local school sites. We know that school sites, principals, teachers cannot do this work alone, and that we must partner with families to ensure that recommendation #1 is as successful as possible. So we are, in the implementation timeline, prioritizing recommendation #1 and recommendation #4. Now, Superintendent Stevens asked me to be, very honest and transparent about what could be some of the barriers that the district might face with respect to implementing this framework, what that might look like, what that might mean. And this slide begins to, as we have a discussion after this, begins to highlight what I see as potential barriers that we are going to need to mitigate if implementation is what you all are considering. Now, these particular ideas are based on the learning circles. We had 4 learning circles that were incredibly well attended by family members in your district, as well as every single one of your principals. It was pretty amazing. Again, I'm currently working with 14 school districts, and I haven't seen that type of principal engagement, administrator engagement in any of the districts as I've seen here. And they came together for these 4 learning circles, again, led by OFI and Vision 2020, to really begin to think about what kind of schools they really wanted their children to be a part of. And when we were talking about what this framework might look like, one of the major concerns that folks from the learning circles and from our LCAP stakeholder meetings, and from the heartbreaking, if you haven't read them, the CSA's focus group summaries from families that participated, this is what they said. I'm summarizing and hopefully bringing to life what they said. They're concerned that the district will fail to implement the recommendations. They have said very clearly, we've been doing this since 1968. And we still see very similar kinds of results that are happening for Black children. And we're concerned that we've put these resources, we've invested in this kind of work, and we won't implement what we're saying, what we think is best for our children. We also heard from families very clearly that we needed to differentiate our recommendations to support a very diverse Black African-American community that resides in Berkeley. One size does not fit all, which is why we're looking at a systemic approach, looking at your macro, your meso, and your micro initiatives, because again, we have different needs and we want to make sure that we address those needs appropriately. There is a legacy of mistrust of district intent, and that's important for us to see and hear, that we bring these kinds of initiatives to the forefront, and there's something happening in the background. There's something that's going on that either will or will not allow these recommendations to take place. And it's addressed loud and clear. Families said it, and it is there for all of us to be thoughtful about. A very aggressive timeline. I've had the honor of working with a school district on a very similar project, asked to come and facilitate a process such as this. And we've been working together for the last 2.5 years and have been extended now for the next academic year to begin some implementation. We've been doing this work for about 6 months, not really even 6 months yet. And it's aggressive, and the way in which we want to vet appropriately and make sure that the community has an opportunity to participate in the process could also be a barrier for the district not implementing this plan. Political will and prioritization. We know that this wasn't necessarily when we think about priorities going through a global pandemic crisis. We know that there were priorities that you all had to attend to. And we also know that these particular data points for Black children are ones that we must address. It is of the highest priority, but is there the political will to do what must be done to change what needs to be changed? We're nervous about and being very thoughtful about the misalignment of TK8 through high school efforts, that there is some dropping off between the two divisions. And what does that mean as relates to transitioning 8th graders to high school? And then as we talk about college and career readiness, what that looks like and means. Also, I mentioned it before, prioritization in the midst of a crisis. We still need to have a very proactive response to recovering from this crisis. Black children especially, because it has now been exacerbated. It also has been widened the gap with respect to their needs, and we need to address that, especially now. Need for community feedback, particularly student engagement. That's something that we didn't get an opportunity to do with the way that we would like to do and need to do for this particular implementation framework. And we must still talk with and get input from our Black African-American faculty, administrators, and staff. Their experience in the district is important to this framework and could also be a barrier if we don't reach into our communities that exist and that are currently doing the work. So those are my summary. It's a summary of my interpretation of what I heard as an active observer and listener from the 6 months that I've been engaged in this work. This final slide that before our discussion is really about where we are. So this gives you an idea that where we still need to go. We still need to finalize some measurable outcomes in each of those categories that I mentioned, the categories and the subcategories. We need to still determine the recommendations, fiscal impact that is important and needs to happen. We need to establish a progress monitoring accountability plan. We still need to host learning circles for our high school community. We haven't done that yet and need to. We believe that it's necessary to create a Black African-American dashboard so that we can see data in the snap of a finger to see where our students are, what they need, and what that looks like and means. We think it's important to create a multi-tiered intervention structure that's based on agreed upon entrance and exit criteria, what those thresholds look like, and have it link back to that dashboard so that we can see information quickly and efficiently. And then lastly, we still need to share with as many folks as possible, district stakeholders, to finalize the recommendations and then bring them back to you all for approval. So that is where we are, what the actual framework process has been. And I'll hand it back over to you, Superintendent Stevens.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Fisher. Appreciate that and look forward to the discussion as well. So as we were prepping for tonight's update to the board, we wanted to be clear that there is still work to come. You heard Dr. Fisher sort of describe a timeline, imagining still that we will continue to be partnered together through the summer and into next year so that we can complete some of the important steps that she's pointing out. And yet there are important actions that we can and will take this summer. So among those things, we already know that we've got a group of administrators, both student services and special education, planning to come together this summer to create a positive climate matrix and a template for individual learning plans that is included in the CSACE document that Dr. Fisher referred to. We also know that we need to orient our incoming education services members to this draft African American Success Framework. We are in a bit of a bench change right now. We've got an incoming associate superintendent of ed services, as well as a new director of state federal projects. We're proposing to come back just after a brief summer hiatus on the August 11th board meeting to share additional information or begin to hang some more details on this plan that will include work over the summer to identify ongoing partner organizations, groups that we already know and work with, like Young, Gifted, and Black and STEM Steps, to identify additional organizations that we can bring to the board, as well as share plans for professional development that integrate the content you heard described in the framework, to talk more about our own sort of internal capacity to implement the African American Success Framework. And I'm going to pause here for a moment because this feels important. There was a comment that Dr. Fisher brought to light, made, I think, by multiple families in these meetings about our willingness to prioritize this work and to staff it properly. And that in the very busy mix of work that we're expected to do as a school district, that it can very often be the case that we write plans, but that we don't have enough people to implement those plans. So one of my commitments over the summer is to engage the Ed Services team to think in serious ways about what capacity, what people we need to be able to do the work that is identified in this plan. I'm not coming this evening with a particular recommendation, but I recognize that if we don't do that, we're very likely to repeat past efforts to create plans, and that just isn't good enough. We know as well that we have worked to launch the CSACE plan for the fall, and particularly two elements of that coordinated intervention plan. One is to establish the Vision Scholar program that Dr. Fisher has referred to. That was part of the documentation that she reviewed, and then as well to launch the individual learning plan work. And the idea there is that these individual learning plans that are included in the CSACE work would dovetail with the kinds of culturally appropriate intervention programs that you just heard listed. As well, we will continue our conversations about funding this work into 21-22. The funding discussions that we'll be having a little later in the evening are not meant to be conclusive. They are not meant to represent all of the necessary funding and investments that would align to this framework. So do know that we anticipate coming back in August just to continue the discussion. And then through the fall, we imagine family and student educator engagement, as Dr. Fisher described it. And then we recognize as well that we have important partners to engage in this work, such as the City of Berkeley, Berkeley City College, and our partners at the Schools Fund, who have been regularly updated both by me and by Dr. Fisher on the progress towards this work, and I think are standing as eager partners to contribute to the overall implementation of this framework. And then finally, I'd propose coming back to the board again sometime in the late fall for a progress update. And I think it's at that point that both Dr. Fisher and I share the same hope that we will have a fully articulated, no longer draft framework that really does include sort of all of the elements and that represents the sort of strategic plan that we're eager to have and then work on. So again, thank you very much for the partnership and the presentation, Dr. Fisher. Looking forward to the discussion and really happy to be able to bring this before the end of the school year.
All right. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much. Where did, oh, there you are. And thank you, Dr. Stevens. Let me turn it over to my colleagues for comments and questions that they might have. That was a lot of information, a lot of really impressive, exciting work. Does anyone want to go first? Okay, go ahead, Vice President Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher, so much for that incredible presentation. I'm gonna just take a second to say thank you, not just for the presentation, but also for coming in and taking in our some of our most important partners in terms of our principals at our schools, also working with our Ed Services team. So thank you. I know you mentioned Ann Caligari, Kamara Gwynn, Bajay in her role. And so thank you for working with those people. This was really impressive to see and just really amazing. I'm gonna ask if you don't mind sharing your screen again. I have a couple of questions. I'll ask two now and then I'll step back and allow my other board colleagues to ask questions as they have them. This is actually the perfect place to start. In terms of next steps, I am actually a little bit concerned about the timeline. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to address the timeline, specifically around the implementation that I think is set to continue to happen in the fall and the late fall. And Superintendent Stevens, since you presented this page, maybe it's best for you to respond, but help me to understand the purpose behind waiting or pushing some of this work out to the late fall, the rationale behind it.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Vice President Brown. So that last sort of element about the late fall is when I imagine that the sort of final steps in in the writing of the framework would be completed. And by final steps, I mean, it's some of the vetting that Dr. Fisher has really pointed out as being so important, taking this draft work out to our families, taking it to our African-American educators, taking it to partners, to be sure that it's not just an internal document, one that a small team made, but that has the sort of blessing, enthusiasm, wisdom of folks from all of our community. And that's really what I imagined as the sort of fall work. We were just, we're not able to complete that sort of stakeholder engagement this semester, but recognize that it's a really important element of the creation of this framework.
Okay, in terms of, well, then I guess that answers the question about family and student engagement, but in terms of educator engagement, and then also partnering with the schools funds, BCC and our COB, and specifically around our educator engagement, what are the plans for preparing folks before their return in the fall?
Yeah, so I imagine that the first step is orienting incoming ed services administrators. We are experiencing this shift change right now. So it's really important to me that those incoming administrators, and particularly the new associate superintendent for ed services, know this work intimately, and then all of the other associated plans like the Black Lives Matter resolution and the CSACE plan. From there, I'm expecting that ed services will begin to integrate this work into the development of a professional development calendar for the coming school year, so that we're launching the school year including this content. But we know that this will not be a one and done professional development experience. We're going to have to build a syllabus for our educators. And so that's work that I expect to happen over the summer. And at the same time, some of the organizational partnerships that Dr. Fisher just described, particularly in that first recommendation about having culturally relevant intervention partners, that's work that I'm planning that we'll either reach out to ongoing partners to make sure that that work is renewed for the coming school year, and continue our work to find other partners in this. So I sort of see that there's multiple stems to this work, all of which can and will move forward over the summer, some of which is going to be ready for educators and some of which we'll need to continue to work on in the fall semester.
Okay. If we're taking the opportunity to talk about our recommendations to this portion of the presentation, I would highly recommend starting that educator engagement work as quickly as possible and prioritizing it for the summer and specifically around professional development. If you don't mind engaging me for one more second, I'm going to ask another question specifically around the recommendations. Do you mind navigating to that page?
Not at all. Let me find them. There we are.
Thank you. And then while we're on this page, I just want to highlight a comment that I think you, Superintendent Stevens, made with respect to the feedback that we got about implementation and being fully ready to do this, and not just, providing lip service, but actually making sure that we meet these intended recommendations. Dr. Fisher, do you mind talking for a couple of seconds about the sub recommendations that you mentioned, specifically around the CLEAR and the SEED interventions for students?
Sure. There is a fleshed out a draft document that has some of the sub actions or sub recommendations, but just to give you an idea, one of the under recommendation number 1 is to identify and utilize minimum achievement thresholds for various grades and subjects to indicate the need for interventions for students whose academic performance falls below the designated thresholds. That's one of the reasons why we talk about a dashboard, is identifying quickly, almost like a early indicator of when students might be in trouble, right? As some type of way to do that. That's what one of the sub recommendations would be, to establish grade level thresholds for math and English, to establish STAR test scoring thresholds, to create the dashboard, as we've mentioned. These would all be some of the subcategories underneath recommendation number 1, including performing statistical analysis to determine demographic composition of classes that are being taken or not being taken, and then developing the plan of action to change those things. Targeted interventions like we did this academic year with our Step Up Academy that wasn't specifically for African-American students, that was for all students, but using it as a framework to provide interventions. Those are the kinds of activities. CTE, STEM Bridge initiative is underneath this recommendation that really would look at making sure, in addition to your emoji class at Longfellow, that there was another opportunity for students to participate in STEM related activities. So there's a series of actions, we call them strategies, that go underneath recommendation number 1.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for sharing those recommendations, the sub-recommendations that go under the 4 major recommendations. I asked that question because last week in our board meeting, Superintendent Stevens, you mentioned that we had a little bit around $2 million that we had left that could be allocated for things of this nature. And I just want to ensure that those funds are still available, and also ask you what's the plan to ensure that those funds are saved or set aside so that we can do these things that have been mentioned in the 4 major recommendations, as well as the sub-recommendations.
I appreciate the question. You're exactly right about the remaining balance in the COVID funding. It's about $2.2 million right now. Coming presentation, we'll talk a little bit about this as well. And it's exactly that intent that we have this balance. We have the makings of the framework with recommendations now coming from this work. And my idea is to match that funding to these recommendations to be sure that as we launch the year, that we have some of these pieces in place, even as we continue to vet the framework.
Will we be seeing that in the August update, or will we be seeing that in the one in the later fall that you mentioned?
That's my intention by August, to report back to the board, work over the summer on professional development, work to identify partners. I would expect that the board will be approving contracts at that point, and that we would be offering an update in keeping with this framework about work between this date and the beginning of the school year.
Okay.
Thank you, Vice President Brown. Director Sinai.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for all the work that you've done, and Dr. Stevens for setting this as a high priority. It's exciting to see, and I have 2 specific questions and then a comment from my board colleagues. My one question is in relation to stakeholders, where does BFT and BCCE fit? I didn't see anywhere where they were engaged.
Yeah, I don't, Dr. Fisher, you can jump in on this, but I don't think at this stage in the development of the draft that they have been engaged. And I appreciate you raising the question. They're really important stakeholders in this process.
They're critical, because what happens in the classroom is there. And so, which leads me to my second question. So I hope that gets identified. And it's more, I guess to me, I'm wondering if your vision of working with our teachers and our staff beyond our administrators is primarily a professional development role, or are they being viewed as key stakeholders? Because the way it's reflected is they're recipients of professional development, but I'm assuming that there's more than that. Could you talk, Dr. Fisher, a little bit about how you view that?
Sure. I see faculty and staff engagement as key stakeholders to this conversation, which is one of the reasons why I put it as a barrier that we wanted to mitigate, that we have to ensure that our teachers are not just recipients. As a matter of fact, your principals wanted to make sure that that was the case, even with our learning circles, that it was a collaborative, collective opportunity for folks to really be a part of the conversation. So it is absolute, but again, with that very aggressive timeline, with the COVID crisis, with school in not, it just wouldn't have been the best time to engage with this particular conversation. But yes, without a doubt, the stakeholders with faculty and staff are very much a part of this conversation.
So when, Dr. Stevens, you come back in the fall with roadmap or the plan, that's going to be more fleshed out. We'll see more evidence of how the teachers and staff will be actively engaged in a stakeholder process.
That's the thinking, yes. By continuing the partnership with Dr. Fisher, we want to bring the draft work, and we're calling it draft for a reason. It's in the current state, sort of given the conditions. We want to take that draft to a number of key groups, and that does include educators. You heard Dr. Fisher refer to educators of color, particularly, and African-American educators, and then bring it to families and bring it to students. And I think she's right to sort of ask that we take time to engage in those critical steps of soliciting feedback on our draft work. So I'm glad to have the draft to show, but we still have that we have to collect feedback on it.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just say one more thing on this topic, but I feel like it's really critical that our labor leaders who represent their communities are actively engaged, because it's, as Dr. Fisher said, it's a barrier when they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And just looking at them as a stakeholder group that gets kind of input versus participants in the design and champions of implementation is a different level. So I'm just really eager to hear more about how that evolves. And then the second question, which will lead me into my board comment, is on slide 15, the recommendations. Dr. Fisher, you mentioned that 1 and 4, that 1 and 4 were like the top priorities.
For next academic year.
Right. I guess I don't know how we can do 1 and 4 without 2, because as you mentioned, we have been through this before. I was one of the architects of the 2020 vision. There's a lot of similarities in the roadmap, in the metrics, in the concerns and lack of trust. And if we don't hold I love the dashboard idea, but if we're not holding, and this is my comment to my board colleagues, if we're not holding our staff accountable to implementing and follow through on this plan with clear metrics, we're just doing the same thing we've done over the last 12 to 20 to 30 years. And I'm hoping that now is a new moment where, with Dr. Fisher, your expertise and coming forward with refinement will help us move forward. But I just don't know how we do 1 and 4 if we aren't doing number 2. So if that is delayed, I guess I'd like to hear more. I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. Again, thinking about how you prioritize what needs to happen. So for instance, for recommendation number 2, there is an action item creating an ideal training profile describing the desired competencies in the area of clear or culturally relevant pedagogy and what that looks like, and identifying the training necessary to achieve this competency level. Now, that particular action item is scheduled for next academic year. So when you do have to see the framework, and again, we didn't want to overwhelm with all of this information, but there are elements of recommendation number 2 that are absolutely going to happen next academic year. All of these things, which is why capacity of a staff to do this or a team to do this is so important. All of this actually has to happen simultaneously. There are elements in each of these recommendations that have to happen, and someone's to make sure that that's happening. So recommendation 2 is going to, but if we had to prioritize what needs to happen and what it looks like, then number 1 and number 4 based on the current data is very important. But there are going to be elements in both recommendation number 2 and 3 that will be happening next academic year, but it's not necessarily aligned with a high priority budget line item that you all have said is a priority. It's not necessarily, or it could be leveraged with your LCAP. Your LCAP currently has, significant resources for professional development that would be, in alignment with this particular recommendation. So I did take a look at what already was going to happen with your LCAP specifically to see that if the framework didn't have specific action items to completely fulfill that recommendation, I know that your LCAP is. It speaks almost identically to the language that's there. So I would say that if you all consider this framework as that roadmap, that we are going down, there's a 4-lane highway. We're going down each of those lanes. It's just at different speeds, but we're all going in the same direction, and those 4 lanes are going that way. It's just we can't do it all at the same time. And that's also the barrier to implementation, is having to prioritize what those actions are that need to come first. So, but it will absolutely be implemented, beginning to be implemented next academic year as well.
Okay, so thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I really appreciate it. And to my board colleagues, I hope we have benchmarks that we can look at over the course of the year, even though they might be process benchmarks and not necessarily academic or social emotional outcomes, but that we've got really clear benchmarks that we hold our district accountable to, so that we show that the commitment isn't wavering based on what individual is in an office or not in an office. Because that's what's happened over the years, is like, there'll be a couple years where someone's gung-ho with the 2020 vision and really wants to take it. They leave, and then it goes dormant for a couple of years until somebody else comes along, and it bounces, between the city and us. And so I just call on my board colleagues for us to really hold our collective feet to the fire, and give Dr. Fisher, Dr. Stevens, and the folks the support they need. But I'd love to see some benchmarks so that we keep it on our agenda, every quarter or something, and we get a check-in, so we keep it moving. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Director Sinai. And just as a time check, we should probably spend not much more than about 15 more minutes on this topic, as important as it is. So I just wanted to mention the time. Let me go to Director Basidev and then Director Babbitt.
Yeah, thanks, President Alper, and thank you, Dr. Fisher, for your great presentation. I'm really excited by a lot of the plans that you presented today. I also really echo the appreciation for the dashboard. I think that that's really where we're going to hold our feet to the fire, and understanding it, getting buy-in from our educators, getting our Teachers of Color Network involved as part of that process, and building out that process, I think, is really important. And then my question is kind of similar to Director Sinai's. When we think about, closing the opportunity gap for our African-American students, I know that other districts have really invested in recruiting Black and Brown male staff. It's like they're very specific in recruiting Black male teachers as part of this process, both to address school climate. So I'm really happy. I just want to say that you're looking both at the school climate element and at the academic elements, right? But I think I just wanted to know, if you did a comparative analysis of our personnel or just our staff, and how we did compare to the other districts too, on whether we have the right staff in place to support our African American learners, and if not, I know that you said that simultaneously we can be doing step number 2 along with the other steps, but I think I just want to underscore also from my board colleagues how important it is that we continue to actively recruit Black male instructors for our district, and that work, is really takes a priority, as soon as possible. I know our hiring processes take a long time, but just having the right staff members in place to help build this out, to help implement, and to support our families. And then on the family engagement side, one of the things that I'm personally really concerned about is college and career readiness for our Black and Brown students. And I've seen the data too on, how our students are graduating, who's graduating with, are there UC and CSU requirements? And I agree that the data in BUSD is particularly worrisome. And so how do we start working on college and career readiness earlier, right? Like the Emoja program is great, but how do we build the Emoja program as part of that track? And I know that I've had high-level conversations with Dr. Stevens and BCC on how both Puente and Emoja could start at the Longfellow level at middle school, as a college, program, how students can possibly earn college credits early. And so I just want to also leverage the opportunities of our local colleges too, to start that college and career readiness conversation a lot earlier with the classes that we have in place right now. So I just want to thank you again, Dr. Fisher. It was a great presentation.
Thanks so much, Director Basidev. Director Babbitt, then I'll make a quick comment.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for your feedback and your comments. And I want to thank the entire team from BUSD who worked so well with Dr. Fisher in getting us this far in the framework. Khadijah and I have actually been having kind of subcommittee meetings with Dr. Stevens and Dr. Fisher, getting updates. And there are several more slides that have been presented to us in these meetings that were not presented tonight. And I just want to highlight those because when I look at the timeline here of August 11th, we have the money. We've already set it aside. So to come back in August 11th doesn't give these programs the adequate time over the summer, in my opinion, to actually plan. For example, we know we want YGB, right? We know we want STEM steps. We've looked at the numbers at every grade level. There's less than 109 students at every grade level that we need to touch. In one of Dr. Fisher's slides, they had already come up with a proposal on how we can touch every one of those families at every stage and creating a true pipeline. And so if we wait till August 11th, number one, we lose the summer time for these sub-organizations to plan. Number two, in reality, let's be very clear, our teachers are going back full time, coming out of COVID, coming out of a lot of issues, right? We don't have, it will take year 2 and 3 to do that. Professional development and training work needs to happen to actually have them implement more of this work. So we are going to have to outsource it. And that's why we set aside that 2.2 million, a portion of that to go with that, right? And so what I'm asking is that we actually be more proactive, because if we wait till August 11th in the fall, then it'll be spring and we still will not have acted now. And when I say our kids can't wait, this is making our kids wait, right? We know the partners, it's already been established what they can do. And so I'm asking that if I could get board colleagues to ask by next board meeting, if there's a shell of a contract that can be updated, that we can approve, because that work needs to happen. Young, Gifted, and Black can't start August 11th, after August 11th, and have a full robust program that they're gonna be able to implement well, right? Same goes for STEM steps, same goes for any other program. Tonight, we approved the EDMO camp, EDMO project, right? We should be able to do that by next week. We should be able to get more of these recommendations, in my opinion, the basic contract approved so that they can start the implementation and planning work so that by fall, we're ready to go. Because if we don't start by fall, it'll be spring. We already know that, yes, we have to get our new ed services team up to speed, but they're not going to be up to speed by fall. They're going to be coming in, they're going to be learning. It's kind of unfair to put them in a position to make some of these decisions when we've had 2 board members who've already vetted a lot of these recommendations already. These providers work in our school district already. And so I'm asking that if we can give board direction to bring back these contracts with regards to the initiatives for the vision learning schools, with regards to how we can touch point each family, K through 12, by next school board meeting. So I'm asking for 2 board members to support me in that request.
Is that a motion that you're making, Director?
Hold on a second. Go ahead, Vice President Brown. There's no, with this, we can give direction. There can be no action on this item because it's on the agenda for discussion. We can.
Okay. Well, Director Babbitt is just asking for a verbal commitment from board members, and I'd like to stand with her in that commitment.
Okay. Dr. Stevens, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I wanted, I guess if I had maybe sort of miscommunicated our intent to be working over the summer, then I apologize. I use that August 11th meeting just as it's the very first board meeting of the summer. It would naturally be the time when we would be bringing already developed contracts and plans to the board. Typically, a contract involves multiple conversations with a provider. It involves developing a scope of work, negotiating a price. Often providers have to think about how they would staff projects. And by signaling that I intend to do that by August 11th, there's planning that would be taking place over the summer, so that once the contract is formally approved by the board, the work can begin immediately. I'm not, if I conveyed in any way that we would only begin planning on August 11th, then I apologize. The idea is to be planning over the summer, but to use that first board meeting to come back to report on our summer progress, but to also ask for approval from the board for these contracts. And then with respect to your request that these contracts come to the board next week, I just described a little bit of the work that's necessary to develop a contract, including scope of work, negotiating price, identifying staffing. And so we could commit to do the best we can in a week's time, but I don't know that I could commit to do a full set of contracts in a week's time, Director Babbitt.
And Dr. Stevens, if contracts were, that work that you just described, if it was done over the summer and then a contract could be entered into that we then ratify.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, and that ratification process just means that the board is essentially sort of signaling, approving work that has already begun. And that's also a permissible action for the board to take.
Okay, great. Because what I don't want to happen is for people to be thrown in the fire again. I really appreciate the work that Dr. Fisher done, as she said, over this tight timeline, right? From January to now, there's so much more that's actually been done and presented that you all haven't seen. And so to be thoughtful about implementation of the service, right? To be thoughtful about those measurements, to be thoughtful about the actions and services actually reaching the family. Let's just talk about recruitment time so that families actually know to prepare for it, to sign up for it, so that family engagement knows how to outreach to families and to explain what it is. Like, those are things that can't happen if it just starts on August 11th. And so since the funding is here, we know the shell of services, we know Dr. Fisher and the organizations that she's recommended and proposed already. Most of them have already worked in our district. I really want to make sure that we move on this because, again, late fall is too late for an update, but to actually start the work mid-year is even worse, right? And that's what will happen if we don't literally pay people now. People don't work for free. So they need their contracts and they need their scope of work over the summer to do the planning work.
I hear you loud and clear, Director Babbitt, and this is going to be a priority over the summer, so that we're reaching out, developing these plans, having these plans ready to go by the beginning of the school year. That is the goal.
But the idea is that we'll be able to hit the ground running when school starts with the actual service provision, not the development of and vetting of the contracts. Is that?
That's correct. This is work that staff needs to take on over the summer.
Okay, Director Vasudev.
I just want to echo just the pressing need again that Director Babbitt and Vice President Brown have stated. Like, we really want to hit the ground running, I think, in the fall. And also what Director Sinai said, we can keep planning, but plans are only as useful as the implementation, right? So I want to make sure that in the fall we hit the ground running, and that, at the very least, we pin this like a really important pressing conversation with our labor leaders for the fall too, so they're on board too with whatever work needs to get done. And we really hit the district running. So I want to thank my colleagues, Director Brown and Vice President Brown and Director Babbitt for their work offline, because I know that there's been work on the side to make sure that we're planning proactively to best serve our African American learners. So thank you for the additional work that you've taken on, and also to Dr. Fisher and Superintendent Stevens for really prioritizing this work.
Thanks, Director Vasudev. Before I go to you, Vice President Brown, I wanted to just bring up one thing that we haven't talked about very much. It was in your presentation, Dr. Fisher, a little bit, which is around discipline and expulsion. And it's an area that we've made great great gains with expulsions, or whatever the opposite of gains is. We've had 0 expulsions. And in my first few years on the board, the district only expelled maybe 1 or 2 students, but there were almost every board meeting there was a kid brought up for expulsion. And in probably, I think the statistics were like 95% of those kids were Black. They weren't all boys, some were girls, but almost every single one of them was Black. And we really made a concerted effort over a period of almost 2 years to change our policy around expulsions, to invest in restorative justice, to train our staff. And it took a lot of conversations in it, and it resulted in, where we are now, which is not only the district not expelling any kids, but really no kids being brought up for expulsion in the last few years. And I think that's something to be proud of. Overall suspensions have gone down, which is also something to be proud of, but the disproportionality in suspensions remains, and it's pretty stark. And so I know I think that was recommendation 3, and I know everything can't be the top priority. And recommendation 3 is, I think, about reviewing the policies. And I think it'll be, as we've been out of school for a whole year, and so there hasn't really been there have been a few, I guess, Zoom related discipline issues, but really we've almost taken a forced break from even having to think about discipline. But all of a sudden everybody's gonna be back in school. And I guess I have just a slight concern that the culture change that we were relatively successful in around expulsions, and that we still had a lot of work to do around suspensions and office referrals and things like that, might get lost in the year that we've been gone. So it's not really a question, I guess it's more of a comment that I hope that we're vigilant about that, because I think that the discipline, and it really is, so expulsions is sort of off, it's not an issue right now, and hopefully it will stay not an issue, but the suspensions is really, the disproportionality in suspensions is really an urgent problem that is kind of foundational to a lot of the other gaps that we see. And I guess I just want to encourage us all to be really cognizant of that issue. We just don't talk about it as much as we used to, in my experience.
Which is recommendation number 3, as you mentioned. When we think about the 4 recommendations, these are the 4 things, the 4 elements that rose to the top.
Okay.
As you can imagine, there were initially maybe 20 different things that folks said, this is what we need to focus on. 4. So
Okay.
number 3, when we look at those disciplinary practices, so much so that we're asking in that recommendation to review and update your district-wide behavioral policies and practices, because we know history tells us coming back into full, school as we have remembered it, and hopefully it won't be the same, but the way that it was, that Black children specifically are going to be disproportionately referred for suspensions and be out of school and out of class. And we want to make sure that we understand what that looks like and means, especially when it's racially motivated for our Black and brown students. So if we are serious about implementing this framework that really does address the needs of Black children, but addresses the needs of all students, all groups of students that are disproportionately, referred for suspensions, refer for special education, are, have the disparities, academic achievement disparities that we have seen, which are Black and brown children in the district, then we cannot deny nor ignore the need for those 4 recommendations.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Vice President Brown.
Thank you, President Alper. Dr. Fisher, first, let me thank you for the comparative analysis. It was really helpful to see where we lie in comparison to other districts, and to kind of help make meaning to these recommendations based off of how other districts are performing or serving their students. I was especially interested in the parent communication I saw in the next step plans about how to engage parents, but I wanted to take an opportunity to take it a step further and ask a couple of questions. I know recently I think in response to the Black Lives Matter resolution, there's been this idea of an African-American Parent Advisory Committee, which the committee would serve to do the similar things that the rest of our parent advisory committees do in the district. Do you think, Dr. Fisher, you can take some time to also talk about maybe how that will work well in our district, or if other districts have been using parent advisory committees to report to the board or what their role is. And then, are there any other recommendations that you would give to us in regards to engaging our parents that you're seeing happen in other districts and maybe we are totally missing the mark on?
I don't think you're missing the mark. I think that actually, you know, it just wasn't noted in that 2014 to 17 LCAP that we were looking at. So again, a comparative analysis is a snapshot in time. So I would use it for what it's intended to be, because the learning circles that we just had demonstrate the engagement that your families have in your district. So I don't want to necessarily, again, we want to put that into context. The comparative analysis was based on frameworks or plans that other districts have said, right? We know have written about whether or not they're implementing and how well they are. That wasn't part of the analysis. It's just what they said they were going to do. Now, what I know for a fact is Berkeley does have a very robust parent engagement process that needs to maybe be systematized a bit. It definitely looks like out of, you know, there are districts in Alameda County that are doing very similar kinds of things. Hayward Unified School District does have an African-American family initiative that what you all were doing with your PCAD and what that looks like is very similar. There's AREA, the African American Regional Educational Alliances, that worked for many years with Berkeley Unified to develop parent advocacy and what that looks like and means. So there are elements in this recommendation number 4, that are built upon, yes, what other districts are doing, but what Berkeley is doing as well. So I think it's important for you all to know that you all actually are ahead of the curve as it relates to parent engagement with a lot of districts in Alameda County specifically. Secondly, we want to take, again, when it's appropriate, we want to take notes from groups that have been very successful. So in this recommendation, we are actually modeling it after what our Latinx brothers and sisters have been doing with respect to DLAC. And we're saying that there needs to be advocacy and advisory opportunities for populations of folks that require it, right? And when it's, especially as relates to significant disproportionality. In that instance, it has more to do with language and making sure that representation happens for folks that will be disenfranchised because of language or marginalized because of language. And we want to ensure that that doesn't happen. It's protected federally. And that's what we are looking at, is how then when we see Black children, Black families being marginalized in ways in school systems, let's use a model that has worked effectively. So what we're proposing in this particular plan is to model the African American Parent Advisory Committee, a district level African American Advisory Committee, very similarly to how DLAC has organized itself, and as well as a model, as well as site-based African American advisory committees. And that's what the learning circles were really bringing to the surface, is how to do that and what that looks like. Right now, there are African American parent initiatives at school sites, but what we're saying is, what if we had a district standard by which we would develop what that looked like and meant? So that's what the recommendation says, is developing that process next academic year, because that does take time, that does take vetting. It does require both sites to be engaged in a very different way, as well as the district to take on a centralized kind of approach, which is not easy to do, and you all may not decide to do, but that is what the recommendation is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fisher. I think we're going to have to move on to our next item, but I want to appreciate again, as we all did, the work that you've done in the presentation tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you, President Alper. And all board directors, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
All right, we're going to move to item 13.1, and then we have 2 public hearings. So just want to again be mindful of the time. Dr. Stevens, I'll turn it over to you. And thank you again to Dr. Stevens, Vice President Brown, and Director Babbitt for all your work as well with Dr. Fisher.
Yeah, I've been especially appreciative of the role that Khadijah Brown and Laura Babbitt have been playing. We're very welcome. Shifting gears, glad to be back with our Assistant Superintendent of Business Services, Pauline Follansby, to continue a conversation that took place last week. This is an action item in which we're proposing a set of budget priorities for funding through two revenue sources, through the unrestricted general fund and through one-time COVID monies. This is going to feel very familiar to members of the board and members of the public. What we'll do is just move very quickly through a set of recommendations, show you how those recommendations were modified on the basis of our conversation last week in the board chambers, and then ask for action by the board. So very specifically, we'll do a very quick review of the remaining general fund revenue, and then jump into this integrated set of recommendations that take into account ideas both from the superintendent and staff, as well as from the Board of Education. This is a very quick overview, unchanged since the last time we viewed it just a week ago. It shows the way that we are dividing into categories, proposals for the expense of a remaining $750,000 in the general fund for next year. $282,000 of that $750,000 is proposed for use where we have positions with existing staff that no longer have revenue sources, as well as mandatory services. We've got a smaller category that we've called essential. This is $10,000 in the first year, although there are a number of additional items in this category. And then a larger category that we're labeling as desirable, $457,000 in expenses. That's a total of just under $750,000 that we're recommending to be approved by the board this evening. And then very important context for all of this, we've highlighted it in pink. It's very apropos of the conversation we just had, is that we're sitting on continue to sit on one-time funds to support student learning loss of $2.2 million. And these things can be used for topics like funding for the African American Success Framework, the partnerships we were just describing, expanded mental health services for our families, tutoring and other supports, other forms of learning loss mitigation, as well as multilingual family engagement. Since the last week, we've had the opportunity to meet with our DLAC representatives as well as our Parent Advisory Committee representatives. I've summarized for you some of the feedback from DLAC, although there is more feedback that we received on June 10th. Just at a very high level, DLAC continues to encourage the district to focus its OFI expansion on moving towards one OFI liaison per school site, or to use data when we're assigning the new liaison positions to schools. And by that, DLAC means, assign liaisons to our most needy school communities. They continue to advocate for full-time ELD teachers at all of our schools, for a full-time TWI coordinator at Sylvia Mendez, as well as full-time math intervention positions at Sylvia Mendez and Thousand Oaks. And then our PAC representatives also provided feedback just today. They represented that feedback earlier in their comments to the board. And these things include, in an order that's slightly different from the document presented today. I took notes just last night. Their recommendations include creating a math master plan, to have programs and positions from the supplemental budget be funded by other funding sources if they don't fully support unduplicated and prioritized students. They're supportive of expanded funding for OFI and Bridge. They want to ensure that student outcome and program evaluation data are collected, analyzed, and reported. Encouraged us to go back and look at the metrics that are in our current LCAP to reflect a higher set of expectations that are both aspirational and realistic, and to increase mental health services to students in the coming school year. And so with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Assistant Superintendent Pauline Follansby. She'll walk through these categories, and then we'll have a discussion and ask for action by the board. So over to you, Superintendent Follansby.
Thank you, Superintendent Stevens. So this will look familiar. We presented this last week for discussion, and we're bringing it back for the vote, the board's vote. And again, these are positions that were previously funded by other funding sources, are currently staffed. And we are proposing that these are actual expenditures that we're committed to, and this was actually built into our budget that I'll be presenting later. And these are 3 positions. On the next slide. And again, these are positions that we brought last week. We are proposing that they continue to be on one-time funding. And these were previously funded by the expired low performing block grant. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So on the next slide, this one has the remaining positions on the existing block grant, as well as a reduction in LCAP budget for the Longfellow literacy coach, as well as continued work on our dyslexia related services for $250,000. So we can see we're requesting, well, we actually have included the 282,063 of these mandatory services and staffing in our unrestricted general fund, as well as $527,000 in our one-time funding. So the next slide is going to bring us to the area where we're going to need board voting in terms of these categories. I'm not going to spend too much time. Nothing really changed since our last presentation. We're requesting additional 1.0 to be paid for the bridge program. The first year is actually funded by our ELO grant, and it was scored as essential in both categories. The next row is based on board feedback, and this is funding an additional cohort in the out years for the bridge program, but we're using one-time funding for this request. The other three proposals were on last week's document, and that includes the communications manager, the ESCAPE, our new enterprise system, as well as the ongoing OFI director position, which is a new director position. And on the next slide, we had brought also 2 OFI positions, one of which would be split between the office and the sites. And the third line has a new proposal where funding an additional 2.0 FTE from one-time funding, and that was a board proposal. We're also going to be proposing the one-time family engagement, one-time community engagement, 70,000, revision of the EL master plan on one-time funding, and $10,000 for reusable dishware. So this is a total that we're bringing to the board for their vote in terms of which of these proposals should be included in the unrestricted general fund and the one-time funding in our 21-22 budget. And the totals are actually showed as a designation. So we're setting this money aside in the unrestricted general fund so that we can accommodate whatever is voted on tonight.
Thank you very much, Assistant Superintendent Follansby. This was just a very quick review of a conversation we had mostly last week. And so we're bringing for action this evening the approval of this final set of unrestricted general fund and one-time expenses for the 21-22 school year. We're asking for approval this evening so that when we come back in a week to approve our full general fund budget, that these elements can be incorporated in. So we're happy to take questions and have discussion and appreciate the board's attention to all of these items.
Thanks, Dr. Stevens. And so you just said this, but just to sort of recap, this is tonight, what Assistant Superintendent Follansby just presented was the proposal from last week, but with the board's direction incorporated. And then the request is that we approve that tonight so that when you present us with the final budget next week, it's essentially what we've already approved, which is hopefully the reflection of what we gave direction about last week and any input in the meantime. So with that, I'll open it up for questions or comments or discussion, and then entertain a motion whenever we're ready. Are there questions or there don't have to be, because it's a pretty similar presentation to last week. And I appreciate the revisions that you've made in response to the board's direction. Director Vasudev?
Yes, it's more of a question and comment for the additional ESSER funds, the 2.2 million that are there, Dr. Stevens. I'm really excited, and I think, I want to echo the concerns that were raised by Latinos Unidos of Berkeley and our Latinx community on the need for district-wide parent engagement in Spanish. Definitely as part of a follow-up to our Latinx resolution that I'm really excited that my board colleagues supported in passing recently. If that position takes a while to hire, right, going through the hiring process, and I know that that's something that's outside of the board's control, that there is funding set aside to do that district-wide engagement as part of those 2.2 million in the fall. So, what that looks like, still TBD. Very, I understand that it takes a while to put contracts in place, so nothing that you have to answer for next week, Superintendent Stevens. But I just wanted to be clear that that work can still continue in the fall.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising this question. So this sort of set of budget priorities is going to significantly expand our capacity to serve our families. It is, I think, a really notable accomplishment of the board that in the last 2 years, there's been an expansion of OFI of 6.5 FTEs, 5 for the coming year, but 1.5 FTEs that are new this year as well. And so this will add a lot of capacity to support Spanish-speaking families. If it's the case that we're not ready to begin that work through our own staff at the beginning of the year, then these additional funds would permit us to engage in some short-term partnership to be able to launch that work.
Right. I just wanted to ask really quickly as a follow-up question, can we also launch some of that work for our Arabic-speaking families if we need, Arabic-speaking family engagement in the fall as well?
I would love to try that out. Absolutely.
Great.
Well, and also just to say, if there's positions that we funded that we haven't been able to fill, that those funds are then available.
That's correct. They're not committed forever. We're committed to a particular course of action, but we've always got the option to change that course if it's not working in the way we envisioned.
Got it.
Vice President Brown.
Thank you, Superintendent Stevens, for your presentation. I did want to take an opportunity to talk about those funds that we have currently, the ones that you just called our committed funds. Just in the spirit of the presentation that we just got from the African American Success Framework, this would be the most appropriate time to ask for some of that money to be set aside for that framework in regards to like specific dollars, yes?
It could be, yeah. I'm not bringing any particular recommendation or a budget for the $2.3 million that's available right now. But I did try to highlight in the presentation that there are several priorities I'm holding that I know are common with the board. And that includes being able to build from the draft African American Success Framework. It includes the other items like mental health that we're hearing very clearly from our advisory committees and community. It includes as well multilingual family support if that's necessary. So there's a sort of short list of priorities that we know we'd like to be able to use for that work. And I do think that we share those priorities in common.
And in terms of the priorities specifically, I understand the other priorities. We talked about those last week, but just we haven't gotten the opportunity this week to talk about the African American Success priorities. This is the first time that we've talked about in our budget conversation. In regards to the initiatives or programs that you were thinking about, Superintendent Stevens, for African American Success Framework, how much of those funds would be needed to ensure that some of these things are able to happen?
You know, it's the right question to be asking. I don't know that I could even offer you the ballpark right now. You know, I could tell you sort of what some of our partnerships have cost us. You know, I do imagine that there's likely hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably $300,000 to $400,000 of commitments, sort of representing the African American Success Framework right now. But I don't have a detailed budget. We haven't sort of costed out each of these particular elements.
Okay, I think it would be a great idea to budget those out. But since you gave a ballpark of about 400,000, I think it would be in the best interest of us as a board to ensure that we are able to set aside that money to do that. And so when the time comes to make an additional recommendation for that, I'd like to support that, which I think will come after Director Basudev's question.
Well, I'll be the judge of that. Director Basudev.
We've been doing so good today. Don't start.
Well, on that note too, I would also like to ask, if you have a ballpark range for mental health support, because I think we know, and districts around California know, that mental health support in the fall will be so necessary for our students district-wide. And so, the exact cost we might not know, but I don't know if you have a ballpark for that yet, Dr. Stevens, but I'm guessing maybe $500,000, or what do you think would be a good set aside for mental health? Because we know we're going to need that district-wide. We've talked about it at several public meetings now as a high level priority. So I'd like to make a motion to set aside some of those funds for something that I think there's a lot of consensus on, that we know that it's critical that we support our students with mental health support in the fall.
Just to respond to the ballpark you threw out there, it's probably a good ballpark figure. And these are all sort of numbers that we're putting together without, sort of properly constructed budget or the kind of detailed conversations we need with partners. But it's, I imagine, a really good starting point.
Okay.
Great.
I'm keeping track of this. Go ahead, Director Sana, and then Director Babbitt.
I just want to echo support for both my colleagues. I think one of the things about creating a ballpark is that, and then authorizing the superintendent to enter into contract, is that most community-based organizations cannot start work until they have an executed contract. Mm-hmm. So we can't, well, we may plan over the summer, they can't plan unless they have an executed contract. So I support the concept of for those two areas where both public comment in almost every meeting has addressed these issues, as well as the PAC and the DLAP.
Yeah, thank you, Director Sana, and I agree, and I agree that those are the two priorities on the list that's there that have been most talked about, are probably the highest priorities. And what I'm hearing my colleagues say is that there's a concern that that money can get eaten up or chipped away at, piece by piece, leaving not enough left to fund these, two of the biggest buckets that we have, which are the African American Success Framework and certainly mental health as well. And so my only hesitation is sort of, and I don't hear Vice President Brown or Director Vasudev saying this, is earmarking too specific of a number without a specific budget. But if we think of it in terms of a ballpark, that could go high, it could be higher than the ballpark. It could be lower, but presumably not significantly lower. Really, that's the sort of target. If in your judgment, Dr. Stevens, it seems about right, then that seems like a reasonable way to go, so that we know, as you're developing these contracts over the summer, hopefully entering into them. So as we said before, you can start work, on day one. And we know we can have confidence that that money isn't going to get, taken away by something else that's good, but maybe not as high a priority as these two things. Does that seem right? I don't know who I'm asking.
Yeah, I completely understand the concept and appreciate that this is being raised right now. It makes perfect sense.
Director Babbitt, I think you had your actual hand raised.
Thank you so much. This may be a little unconventional, but because I do have some of the slides.
You muted yourself, Director Babbitt.
Which did kind of talk about some of the costing. Would it be okay if I shared my screen, just so that when I make this motion, you guys kind of have a real understanding of where I'm coming from with these numbers that I'd like to propose we use?
Sure.
Okay. It's disabled for me.
Director Babbitt, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. All right, great. Can you all see my screen over here?
Mhm.
iTunes. So what you'll see here is the framework and the discussion that was had between Dr. Fisher's office in conjunction with our staff, as well as with the Berkeley Public Schools Fund, in an effort to move this work forward so that there's not multiple contracts and so that it can actually happen sooner rather than later. And of these recommendations that I fully support, it would be the African American Parent Advisory Committee, that's $25K. The advisory committees, that's another $25K. The parent learning circles going K through 12. We know we didn't have that opportunity to do that for the high school. And in this regard, it could also include our Latinx families who we know we want to include in these conversations. YGB is here at 50K. The dashboard, which is so important, is here at 75K. And then this pipeline here for academic intervention and mentoring direct services was estimated at 250K. And so if you go to the next page, you'll see you'll see what those vision schools are for that 250K right here. In that focal scholar program, that will allow intensive interventions for our vision schools with respect to our CSACE. 126 Black African-American students are in that population. 56 Latinx students are in that population over these 5 schools. And so while I realize that there's work to be fleshed out and we want our staff to be a part of it and we want, learning loss plans, we know for a fact that we need to offer some direct services to these students to be in accordance with our CSACE. So that number of all of those things that I just highlighted from this framework is actually $610,000.
Director Babbitt, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second, just because I have a slight Brown Act concern with the sort of an action item based on specific programs like this that weren't part of the agenda. But I'm wondering if what you're proposing,
what I'm proposing is a motion for these funds to be set aside, but I just wanted you to have a basis for where these numbers are coming from.
Yeah. So do you mind just unsharing for a second? I think it's helpful to see, that gives it, the way I view what you just presented, Director Babbitt, and thank you, is a little bit more specific of a ballpark, basically.
Exactly.
So I think that, and I want to ask Dr. Stevens your thoughts and reaction to that, which I would be comfortable with supporting if that ballpark is a little higher than what we just talked about. I feel uncomfortable saying we're approving those specific expenditures that we haven't that we haven't seen the details of, but that if that gives us a more realistic ballpark, and then consistent with sort of the direction that we gave in the previous conversation, which was to get going on those things as quickly as possible. I think that sort of accomplishes everything we're trying to do. Does that feel right to you, everybody? You're nodding. Okay. So if the ballpark for, what did we say? The ballpark for the African American Success Framework is around 600,000, and mental health the same, or about 500,000 of that 2.2 million. Is that, Dr. Stevens, does that seem about right to you?
Yeah, all of these numbers seem about right, and is we're talking about ballpark numbers.
Okay.
Details still to be determined.
So I think unless anyone has strong feelings about making the motion, if I could just summarize what I'm hearing, and then if this is wrong, I'm happy to take a substitute motion or friendly amendment. But what I'm hearing us say is we want to well, the motion I'll make is to approve the budget priorities that have been presented tonight, and set aside of the remaining COVID relief funds, a ballpark of $600,000 to support the African American Success Framework, and a ballpark of $500,000 to $600,000 to support mental health services.
Can
Period.
I just add, and authorize the superintendent to enter into contracts over the summer so that our community-based partners can plan?
Yeah, I think he can do that anyway, so I don't think that has to be action, but it can be sort of coupled with direction that happen to the best of staff's ability.
Can I add to the motion?
Sure.
That we give direction to the superintendent and staff to, as you mentioned in your comment earlier, President Alpert, to go above if necessary. That the
It's not a cap.
600,000,
Sorry.
yeah, that the $600,000 and the $500,000 to $600,000 are not caps, but opportunities to go, giving the superintendent opportunities to go above that if necessary.
Yeah, I was using the technical term ballpark. Yes, okay, I think that. Director, do anybody still have their hands up, or is that?
I do. I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So what does the additional $600,000 include from the 400 to the 600?
Well, I think it was just that the 400 was a very rough ballpark, and that was not based on, I don't know, it was based on a comment that Dr. Stevens sort of made offhand, and then just sort of summarizing what happened. And then Director Babbitt gave us some more details that itemized to some extent some of the things that they all have discussed and talked about that haven't, I guess, they aren't ready to have come to the board for specific approval or enter into contracts as of tonight, but that's what the overall price tag looks like. It'll be closer to 600.
Got it. So I guess my specific question, which we don't have to answer now until we get more specifics, but did that 600 include the addition of staff hired on one-time funds?
No, it didn't.
It didn't. Okay.
It didn't.
So I just want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a situation where we're hiring more staff on one-time funds. Just wanted to clarify that. All right.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And we're not approving with that part of the motion any specific items, but
so it will have to come back to us.
It will come back to us. I just wanted us to have a more reasonable number in our estimate based on work that's actually been done. So the ballpark has actual ball in it.
Yeah, and I think that work, and I appreciate you sharing that work, Director Babbitt, because it includes also some of the Latinx students too. And so that makes a lot of sense.
Director Babbitt transformed, we went from the Oakland Coliseum to like Oracle Park. Okay, that's my motion. Is there a second?
I'll second your motion.
Okay. Ms. Chires? And Dr. Stevens, does that sound, before we vote, are you comfortable with that?
Yes, everything you're saying.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Chires.
Even the ballpark portion of it?
Yeah. We're actually
makes me nervous.
Yeah. We don't overuse sports analogies too much. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Chires.
Director Vasabev,
Yes.
Director Babbitt,
Yes.
Director Sinai,
Yes.
Vice President Brown,
Yes.
President Alpert.
Yes. All right, great. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you, Superintendent and Assistant Superintendent Follansby. All right, now we're going to move to the first of two public hearings. The first is on the Local Control and Accountability Plan, the LCAP. I'm going to open that public hearing now, which means that if you, this is your lucky night, the 22 of you who are here, because there's actually 3 now opportunities for public comment. There's a public comment now with respect to the LCAP. There'll be public comment with respect to the budget at the next public hearing, and then there'll be our normal public comment period at the end. I see one member of the public with their hand up. And so I'm going to go to her, Ms. Nofelt, and then I'll close the public hearing and we'll have the discussion. Ms. Nofelt, you can have 3 minutes. And thanks for being here.
Thank you. On April 7th, a cohort of parents asked the board to engage with families, asked the school district and CC'd the board to engage with families of students with disabilities in order to provide input on the use of one-time monies and the LCAP. On May 10th, the North Region SELPA Community Advisory Committee asked for the same thing. I am part of both of those groups. I am a board appointed member to the CAC. I helped draft the statement that the CAC made, and Sherry Washburn came up and spoke to you in public comment. Many people recognized her words as being full of truth and need. And I have to express my disappointment with the lack of response, the lack of engagement, and how the COVID funds and the LCAP do not reflect the community of students with disabilities, and that the COVID funds have been depleted and earmarked without disability community conversation. Millions have been recently approved going to things that don't address student learning loss. The community surrounding students with disabilities, along with nearly every other group advocating for those who are identified with unmet needs, is ready. We're waiting. We're asking for data, accountability, and transparency in the spirit of helping all students succeed. We need to address improvement in a systemic, deliberate way based on collecting data that we do not yet have. We need to create a plan and a system, engaging with teachers and making sure we have consistent tracking of the efficacy of programs. It's essential to making this a new moment where we expect all of our students to succeed. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nofelt. And President Alpert needs to step away for a second, so I will be taking over. But thank you, Ms. Nofelt, for your comments. We will now move to, we will now close the public hearing for the Local Control and Accountability Plan and open up the public hearing for the 2021-2022 preliminary budget.
Okay.
And Vice President Brown, I wonder if I could take about 5 minutes or so to update the board just on changes that have occurred in the LCAP since last week.
Absolutely.
I'd love for the board just to be aware of those changes. And I'll do this relatively quickly. I do have a quick presentation. I'll share my screen with your permission. I'm going to keep these remarks very brief. I'd just like to bring the board along with some minor changes taking place to the LCAP in response to feedback we're hearing both here in the board chambers and then as well from our advisory committees. We have prepared this presentation. It's available for the public, and it offers a summary of a number of different elements of the feedback, some of which we saw in the last presentation, and I'll just move pretty quickly past. For members of the public, there is a representation of the total amount of funding in the district, as well as the amount of funding that's being represented in the LCAP. And this is meant as really a reminder that there's a large amount of sort of operating expenses of the district not represented in the LCAP, and that there are many other action items, including elements of our special education programming that are not necessarily represented in the LCAP, but that are happening nonetheless. And as an example of that, it is also, I think, one of our accomplishments this year that we're adding to the special education team almost 10 FTEs, full-time positions to our special education staffing. And this is actually the single largest investment in staffing that we're making this year. Although we have not been speaking about it as much, it's something that we've already agreed on and are working on filling those positions. This is a very brief representation of all of the community feedback that we've been soliciting over the now many months that we've been working in preparation for this LCAP draft. I've already shared with board members of the public, feedback that we received just last Thursday evening from our DLAC, as well as feedback from last night from the PAC. And then let me just get to the sort of several changes that have taken place. So we have, in response to concerns about math being represented in only one goal, made sure that they are both represented in terms of core curriculum and intervention. We've added an additional line into the LCAP committing to math curriculum and educator engagement in the 21-22 school year. That's marked with a $50,000 price tag to be funded from existing funds in the Ed Services Department. As well, we've listed in the LCAP the family education liaison positions that are now approved by the board. And then as well, added into the LCAP work that we had planned to do anyways to continue engaging our educators on our K-12 assessment system. We do continue to, in response to the sort of concern about metrics, what we're proposing is that as the new Ed Services team comes on board, that we will commit over the summer to revising, both reviewing and then potentially revising the targets that are listed in the current LCAP. And that would include the state balance assessment targets for the 3rd, 6th, 8th, and 11th grade. So it's just a very brief update. I wanted to make sure that the board is aware of these relatively small tweaks taking place with the LCAP on the road to the approval of the LCAP next week. And thanks very much for that, Vice President Brown.
Thank you, Superintendent Stevens. Director Sinai?
Just a quick clarification. You mentioned the OFI, the 90,000 for the split. I think we talked a little bit about, so that doesn't mean that the money that we approved or directed last week for the additional OFI positions aren't included. You just don't have it in the LCAP.
We plan to update the LCAP so that it includes the full OFI investment. And now that that's approved, we'll be sure that that's included in the version that comes to the board next week.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions from board directors? Okay, well, hearing none, we will now open up the next hearing for the 2021-2022 preliminary budget. Is there anyone here to make a public comment? No? Seeing none, Superintendent, do you also have a presentation or update for this as well?
We do. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Assistant Superintendent Pauline Follansby again, and she'll walk us through the elements of the larger general fund budget, not just the priorities that we approved. So over to you again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping everybody can see this. I'm going to make it a little bigger if I can. So everybody can now see my screen. So I'll be presenting the 21-22 preliminary budget, and I'll be bringing this back for approval at next week's meeting.
Hey, Pauline, could I ask you just to click on the present button, and that way?
You know, I can't find the present button. Hold on. It's hidden behind.
Okay.
My
Would you prefer that actually, I don't know that I've got your deck open right now.
Your mouse was almost there. You see the orange share button?
Where?
On the top right. Go down. It's like that near your beach picture on the right.
Yeah.
And then there you go.
Oh, it's behind here. Aha. There it is. Thanks.
No,
no, that's not. No, I can share it with other people. No, that's not it. Thanks, Laura. There's a present button somewhere. Oh, here it is, right next to it.
There you go.
There we go. Thanks.
Thank you.
Success. Thanks, guys. I'll be presenting tonight the preliminary budget. And before I actually present this, I want to take a moment to thank the team for putting this together. It was a lot of work, long hours, and I just want to publicly acknowledge their contribution. So tonight, we will be discussing the preliminary budget, and it will be brought back next week for voting. So again, the focus of this presentation is always the unrestricted general fund. Earlier you heard the presentation on the LCAP. This focuses just on the unrestricted general fund. And I'll be presenting the budget summary and highlights, as well as the variance reports and multi-year projections, reserve disclosure for funds 1 through 8, and a brief summary of next steps. So again, I keep mentioning this, everybody should know it's the unrestricted general fund, but we're looking at the entire year. So we're presenting projected financial activity for the fiscal year. And we are basing this on the governor's May revision, which is the most recent information that we have. The governor should be approving a budget by the end of the month. The legislature approved the state budget yesterday and took it to the governor for his review and approval. And we will bring back a revised budget if there are significant changes, and that's usually in excess of $600,000. And we will bring it back to the board by July 29th if there are significant changes. And right now, the sticking point between the legislature and the governor has to do with STRS and PERS. So right now, we're paying almost an additional $1 million in STRS and PERS, and the legislature is proposing that the rates not be increased. So that will be significant savings for most districts. We do have a positive certification, which means we're maintaining a positive ending fund balance for the current year and 2 subsequent years. However, I need to mention that we are still having a structural deficit. We are deficit spending by 1.6 million, and we ended up with an undesignated fund balance of 1.1 million. But more about our structural deficit, we're basically spending more than we're bringing in. So we're spending down our savings account, which is never good budgeting. And we're proposing that going forward, we present a balanced budget as opposed to one with just a positive ending fund balance. So that should be our fiscal goal. The budget priorities that you voted on tonight, they're designated in the ending fund balance. And now that they're approved, when I bring the budget back to the board next week, we will have these items included in the restricted and unrestricted budget as expenditures. So this year, there's several things that that's a little different. ACOE is asking us to present that's the Alameda County Office of Ed. They're requiring us to present 2 multi-year projection scenarios, one with and without one-time expenditures. And this is largely due to the overwhelming funding for COVID, one-time funding. However, in our district, the multi-year projection without one-time funding will only affect our restricted multi-year projections, which I don't typically share with the board. But we do have a packet that we loaded on the online, and that actually has the multi-year projections with and without the one-time expenses. So the budget priorities, and I mentioned this earlier, they are designated in the ending fund balance. So this is a variance report that I'll be taking you through. And before we look at the detail of this, I just want to summarize the major changes. We are having increased revenue of $4.1 million due to the mega COLA. And I had discussed this on several occasions with the board earlier. And this is giving us a significant increase, but this is actually 21, 22, and 2021 COLA that the governor is kind of making up for. We do have significant expenditures, $5.3 million. And that's because we did have a negotiated salary increase. The 1% on schedule is in the unrestricted general fund. The 3.5% is on restricted funding. However, there are increases in statutory benefits, including the unemployment rate and STRS and PERS. And when I take you through the detail, you'll see the detail of what's causing these changes. So this is the variance report, and our revenues went from $92.8 million at the estimated actuals. This is when we did the second interim as modified when we were taking savings for the preliminary budget. So the $96.9 million actually represents an increase of the $4 million that I mentioned earlier. This increase of the $5.3 million is actually shared on your on another slide, and that takes into account, it breaks out all the different changes that's contributing to this $5.3 million. It has to do, as I said, predominantly with the 1% increase, as well as the increase in STIRS and PERS and the unemployment rate. So you can see the unemployment benefits went up significantly more than the classified and certificated salaries. Our transfers out, for 2021, we had estimated $1.3 million for the nutrition services program, and that was to sustain the program during COVID times. We're projecting that due to increased participation, projected increased participation, and also a slight increase in the rates, that we wouldn't be contributing $1.3 million, we will actually be contributing $700,000, which gives us a positive variance of $577,000, which is mainly mainly making up that $702,000. Contributions actually before that, in last year we had a one-time contribution from the post-employment benefit fund, and this year we're not depending on that fund for any for a contribution. BSEP's contribution went up by $865,000, and that in part is due to the increase in the salaries and benefits for our teachers, the 1% and the 3.5%, which affects the average teacher cost. So this is an expense that to BSEP, an additional contribution to the general fund. And for special ed, the prior year, 2021, had $1 million in one-time expenses for mental health that we're not projecting for this year. And as Dr. Stevens mentioned, we are anticipating filling all the positions that we had, that the vacant positions as well as additional positions from other funding sources. So there's actually, we're projecting a reduction in special ed because of the removal of one-time expenses. So overall, this is where we're looking at the net decrease or increase in the fund balance is what we look at to determine if we're deficit spending or if we have a surplus. So we had a slight surplus in 2021, but you see we're deficit spending by $1.6 million. So we're spending down our beginning fund balance to give us an ending fund balance of 2.9 or $3 million. But of course, we have to designate that we're setting aside part of that $3 million for our revolving cash, which is like our petty cash fund throughout the district. Our economic uncertainties, the district's share of the 3% after the amount in our Fund 17. The LCAP reserves, we're showing this at $800,000, and that is, I know the board has been saying $1 million, but I think at one point 200,000 was committed, and we can revisit that. And of course, the board priorities of $750,000, and it leaves us with an undesignated balance of $1.1 million, which is a very tight budget. We're deficit spending, we're spending down what fund balance we're bringing forward. So at this point, it's very difficult for the general fund to increase expenses without making an equal reduction in other cost areas. So I will go back to the summary. So this brings us to a multi-year projection. And this is a multi-year projection that we usually present. This has in one-time expenses. And We are in an area of a COLA only LCFF funding. And of course, with increased costs, we are forced to deficit spend. So unless there's additional revenue from the state to mitigate, we either will need to have additional funding from the state, or we'll have to make budget reductions to balance our budget in the out years. And this, I've shared this with you in terms of the assumptions that we've used to build the budget, and this is based on the governor's May revise. We've reflected the increase in LCFF base and revenue funding, supplemental funding for all 3 years. And when adding in state funding and other local funding, we're looking at total revenue of 101 million, 99 million, slightly being impacted by the cliff, even though it's not as much as it was. And then a funding of 102 million, 102.2 million, and that's, we have a higher COLA in 23-24. And this is an interesting slide, our expenditures in 21-22. This would not include the expenses you just approved, they're designated below here. So with looking at our expenses and our total sources and uses, this is what we talked about in the variance report, and our designations leaving the 1.1 million. When we come to 22-23, we are going to be forced to do budget adjustments, either increase the revenue or budget reductions of 4.5 million and an additional $300,000 in 23-24. And that's so as we would have a positive ending fund balance and enough to meet most of our commitments and assignments after the ending fund balance. So this is a significant number here, the 4.5 million and the 4.8 million. And actually at the next board meeting, the Alameda County Office of Ed is requiring districts to come up with a list of items that they're planning on reducing or budget reduction ideas, as well as timing. And this has to be, I think this has to be a board resolution. So I'll be bringing this back to the board along with the adopted budget. So that's another change to this year. So this is just a summary of of the contributions in and contributions out. So I've kept, everything is pretty much flat from one year to the next. We're not expecting significant changes. So that's just a quick summary. And this is a slide that we have to do for a revenue level disclosure. It's pretty complicated, but any amounts over our 3% will have to be explained. So this is our 3% requirement here. And this is the amount in excess of the 3% when we're looking at what our balances are for the ending fund balance. And this is looking at funds 1 through 8. So this is a required disclosure by the county. And we will explain that even though we actually have 10 million and 12 million in the third year, these include BSEP balances. So even though they're in the unrestricted general fund, they're restricted for BSEP purposes. And then we're designating these amounts as well. So we're just required to explain that to the county, and we will have a separate disclosure for that in the final budget as well. So next steps, as I mentioned, that should be 2020, not 2022, but we are going to be taking this to the board for adoption at the next board meeting. We are required, as I mentioned, to have a public hearing regarding the minimum reserve, which is that slide I just shared with you. We're also going to have a resolution to identify budget reductions in the multi-year projections, including the timeline, and that's an ACOE request. The next step would be the governor's adopted budget. And as I mentioned, if there are significant changes, I'll be bringing back the budget revised, it's called 45-day budget revised to the board within 45 days if it's required. So at this point, I will take questions, or if there's anything I can provide additional information on.
Assistant Superintendent Follensby, do you mind if I jump in on a quick question? Could you help us understand the new Alameda County Office of Education requirement that we would pass a resolution for potential 22-23 reductions? Do you understand the rationale behind that new requirement?
I think the county office has had several districts that will just put a placeholder in a budget just to get it balanced without a lot of thought in terms of how are they going to make these budget reductions and what's their timeline. So I think the county just wants districts to be more mindful and more thoughtful when we're thinking of budget reductions, and have a plan before just presenting these credits that kind of like just to balance the budget. So I think it's prudent. It's a prudent request.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Follensby. We'll go to board directors for questions. Director Sinai, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, just a quick question. Dr. Stevens, have you gotten any update on our enrollment numbers? Are they inching up to normal, or are we still needing to be on the moderately conservative side?
Yeah, we have been paying close attention to this. We right now seem to be on our way to pre-pandemic enrollment. And it seems, I did notice the multi-year projection here sort of lists still a potential loss of about 400 students. While we don't have that confirmed enrollment yet, we seem to be on our way to a full enrollment recovery back to our pre-pandemic levels.
Director Babbitt.
Yes, I have a question. Is there a possibility that our COLA will increase for next year and we just don't have that information yet?
Thank you for your question. We use the assumptions in the school services dartboard, and they give us the projected COLAs for several years. So when the governor has his budget in January, there's an opportunity for the COLA to be revised up or down. And then the May revise also reiterates that number. So we base all our assumptions on the school services dartboard, which gives us the assumptions for several years. And until that's updated, we we don't make changes until we receive updated information.
But in actual reality planning, one of our roles as a board member is to advocate for increased funding at the state level and any needs that we may need at the state level. So would this be an area where we should start advocating earlier so that we get those COLA numbers? Because to start thinking about reductions that may be unrealistic if the COLA increases, it kind of makes people uneasy unnecessarily. And so I'm just wondering if, number one, we can do that. And then number two, if that would be helpful in any other recommendations you have, Assistant Pauline Follensby, on how we can help increase funding to just come into our district. I would love to hear those thoughts and be a part of that advocacy effort. And then I also want to make sure that we really focus in on medical reimbursements, especially as we use a lot of these funds for social emotional health, if as possible, with clinicians and billing hours. And there is a subsystem, like another patchwork or plugin or something that we need to implement along with Escape, that we're really, I don't know if it's Escape is the right one, but when we improve our business systems, really be mindful of that, because that is a huge way to get money back that we have spent in excess of what we would need to spend. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other board member comments? I don't see any other hands. Okay. Thank you, Associate Superintendent Follansby, for your presentation.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We will now close the hearing for the 2021-2022 preliminary budget, and we will now move to additional or second opportunity for public comment. So if you'd like to speak again during the public comment section, go ahead and raise your hand now. If you are here to speak for a second opportunity. Seeing no hands, are there additional board member comments? No. Seeing none, then our meeting is adjourned at 10:10 p.m. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.